He walked into every room like the ceiling had been built specifically to frame him, and London believed it. Duke Damien Blackthorne didn't merely occupy space. He claimed it, restructured it around the geometry of his jaw and the cold mathematics of his ambition. Women forgave him things they'd have buried other men for. Men called his ruthlessness vision. And Eveline Ashcroft, who once knew the particular warmth hiding beneath all that polished granite, understood something nobody in those gilded ballrooms ever bothered to learn. The most dangerous architecture isn't stone. It's the story a powerful man tells about you before you ever open your mouth to speak. She never got the chance. He made sure of that. But stories, unlike stone, have a way of developing cracks. And what crawls out of those cracks doesn't always stay quiet forever. The morning they destroyed her, London smelled like coal smoke and hothouse roses. It was the kind of late October morning that couldn't quite decide what it wanted to be. The sky a bruised silver that pressed down over the rooftops of Mayfair like a lid on a pot about to boil over. Eveline Ashcroft had woken early, as she always did, with the particular alertness of someone who had learned, somewhere deep in the architecture of her nervous system, that stillness was a luxury she couldn't entirely afford. Not in this city. Not in this life. She lay in the narrow bed of her rented rooms on Cavendish Square. Not the grandest address she'd ever slept in, but honest, and hers, and listened to the coalman's cart scraping over cobblestones 3 floors below while her mind moved through the shape of the coming day. She had a fitting at 10, a letter to post to her solicitor regarding the final paperwork on the Wiltshire property. An afternoon engagement. She'd been invited to Lady Pemberton's informal musicale, which meant 40 people pretending to listen to a soprano while they actually conducted the season's most consequential gossip across decorative fans. Eveline had been navigating those rooms for 5 years with the practiced ease of someone who'd had to learn their rules from the outside, from observation rather than inheritance. She was not born to this world. She had arrived in it, which in the eyes of the aristocracy was something between an achievement and an offense, depending on who was looking. She was 26. Her father had been a merchant of genuine brilliance who died leaving her more money than connections. Her mother, dead longer, had left her something harder to quantify. A quality of attention, a refusal to let people be merely decorative to her, a habit of looking directly at things that polite company preferred to regard sideways. These were not, as it turned out, universally appreciated qualities in a woman navigating London society, but they had brought her, 2 years prior, into the orbit of Damien Blackthorne. She didn't let herself think about that yet. The day was still clean. She had learned to keep the mornings clean. She rose, dressed without her maid. She'd given the girl the morning off, some family errand in Whitechapel, made herself tea that was stronger than fashionable, and stood at the window watching the square come alive below. A nursemaid pushing a perambulator, a pair of gentlemen walking quickly in the direction of their clubs, collars up against the chill, a flower seller arranging chrysanthemums the color of old blood against the iron railing across the street. Eveline watched her work and felt for a moment the particular melancholy of someone who is happy in their solitude but aware always of its borders. She was thinking about the Wiltshire letter and whether she needed to include the secondary deed when someone knocked at her door with the particular urgency that meant news rather than social call. It was Mrs. Hartley's boy, Mrs. Hartley being the landlady, and the boy being her nephew of 17 who functioned as a general runner for the building. He was out of breath and holding a newspaper with the expression of someone who had been rehearsing how to hand it over. "Beg pardon, Miss Ashcroft. Mrs. Hartley thought you ought to see. She said to bring it straight up." Eveline took it. He left without meeting her eyes. The column was on the 3rd page, buried just enough to seem incidental, prominent enough to be found by everyone who looked. It was framed as a society item, the kind of breezy notation that the paper's social correspondent specialized in, light, malicious, written in the particular tone of someone who has been told exactly what to say and has arranged it to look like observation. The headline was almost gentle in its precision. Miss A. of Cavendish Square. A warning to wealthy families regarding calculated feminine ambition. She read it standing up. She read it twice. The second time she registered the specific details, the insinuations about her origins, the suggestion that her friendship with various titled families had been orchestrated rather than genuine, the unnamed source close to the Blackthorn household, who had apparently provided the paper with a full account of how one ambitious young woman of mercantile background had pursued the Duke with what the column described delicately as troubling persistence and material expectation. The column didn't name Damien. It didn't need to. Every person in London who operated in those circles would understand exactly whose reputation was being protected and whose was being sacrificed. Evelyn set the paper down on the windowsill. Below, the flower seller had finished arranging her chrysanthemums. The morning was no longer clean. She understood, with the clarity that only arrives when something you feared but didn't quite believe finally materializes, that she had approximately 12 hours before this became the only story anyone in London would be telling about her. She had been wrong about the 12 hours. It was closer to 4. By early afternoon, the machinery of it had already been set in motion in ways she was only beginning to map. Lady Pemberton's musicale was, as communicated via a brief formal note delivered by a footman who avoided her gaze, regrettably oversubscribed. 2 invitations she'd received earlier in the week were quietly withdrawn, the withdrawal accomplished through the elegant social mechanism of not being withdrawn at all, simply no longer being acknowledged. A friend? She had considered Clara Wyndham a friend, sent a card that said, "I'm sure there's a perfectly good explanation," in a tone that made clear no explanation would be considered adequate or desired. Evelyn sat in her rooms and read each communication with the methodical attention she'd trained herself to apply to unpleasant information. She was making a kind of internal map. Here is what is gone. Here is what may yet hold. Here is what was never as solid as it appeared. The last category was the largest. She had known, in some part of herself, that her position in London's social world was built on foundations that the aristocracy did not regard as permanent. She was wealthy, but not landed, well-connected, but not born to connection, liked by many, but sponsored by none. She had navigated 5 years of that precarity with intelligence and care and a genuine warmth toward the people in those rooms that was, she believed, real, not performance. She had liked them, some of them. She had found the world they occupied, for all its cruelty, genuinely interesting in the way that closed systems are interesting. Their internal logic, their elaborate social grammar, the way status moved through them like weather. What she hadn't fully accounted for was how quickly that warmth would be irrelevant once someone with real power decided to point a different story in her direction. She was thinking about this, sitting at the writing desk she used for correspondence, not writing anything, just thinking, when her door opened without a knock and Damien Blackthorn walked into her rooms. He was as she remembered him, and nothing like she'd expected him to be in this moment. Tall, dark-coated, with that particular quality of physical presence that his family bred into its sons like a second inheritance, a gravitational self-certainty that most men only approximated. His face was controlled in the way she'd learned to read over 2 years of close attention, jaw set, the muscle along it doing very little work, which meant he was doing the work internally instead. His eyes, which were an unremarkable gray that somehow managed to be arresting in his face, moved over the room with the automatic assessment of someone who habitually calculated exits. He closed the door behind him. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The silence had a quality that Evelyn recognized. It was the kind that fills up with everything that can't be said directly. She looked at him the way she'd trained herself to look at things she'd rather not see. Steadily, without performing either coldness or hurt, just looking. "You should have knocked," she said. The door wasn't locked. He moved to the center of the room and stopped. He didn't sit. His hands were at his sides with a stillness that she knew, by now, was controlled rather than natural. "I needed to speak to you before this gets worse." Before it gets worse. She considered the phrase. "Did you come to warn me or to assess the damage?" Something moved across his face. "Evelyn, don't." The word came out flat. Not angry. Not yet. "Don't use my name like that. Like it's something that requires gentleness right now. Tell me what you came to say." He looked at her for a long moment. Then, "I came to ask you not to speak publicly about what you know." The room was very quiet. Outside, the Coleman's cart had come back around. She could hear the horse's hooves on the wet cobblestones, the specific rhythm of weight and pavement. "I see," she said. The engagement to Cecilia Whitmore will be announced at the end of the month. He delivered it like information rather than confession, which she supposed was what it was. His posture remained absolutely even. The family's situation requires it. The column this morning was meant to preempt certain questions, to establish a particular narrative before I could offer a different one. He said nothing. You needed me to look like the kind of woman no one would believe. She heard her own voice producing the words with a steadiness that she found, even in the moment, slightly remarkable. So anything I said about the debts, about the money, about it would look like a scorned woman making accusations. That's elegant, Damien. That's actually very well constructed. It wasn't... He stopped. The muscle in his jaw did something. What? It wasn't personal? She stood up, not dramatically. She simply found she didn't want to be sitting for this. It wasn't intended to be cruel, or it was necessary, and the cruelty was just the shape necessity took. Both of those are true, he said, and the steadiness with which he said it, the simple, unvarnished acknowledgement, landed harder than any justification would have. She looked at him standing there in her room, and she understood something that she hadn't quite understood in its full dimensions before. He wasn't here to apologize. He wasn't here for absolution or forgiveness or to make this easier for her. He was here because he was a man accustomed to managing situations, and she was a situation that needed managing, and some part of him had calculated that a personal conversation might be the most efficient method of containment. She almost admired it. She was horrified to find that she almost admired it. The documents I signed, she said. The transactions. You know what I have. I know what you have. He didn't look away. I'm asking you, as someone who has reason to know that I don't ask for things easily, to let this go. To leave London if you need to. I'll ensure your financial situation is compensated? The word came out with more edge than she'd intended. You'll compensate me for my reputation. You'll settle the cost of having my name dragged through a newspaper and my friendships dissolved in an afternoon? What's your rate, Damien? What does that come to? I know what you're trying to do. She walked to the window. She needed something to look at other than his face. You're trying to close this cleanly, tidy up the loose end. I understand the logic. I just find I'm not willing to cooperate with it. The silence came back. She heard him shift his weight. If you produce those documents, he said, if you attempt to use what you know to, the family will respond. I'll respond. The story will become significantly worse for you, Eveline. I need you to understand that. She turned to look at him then. The afternoon light was coming through the window at an angle that caught the dust in the air between them and made the whole scene look, for one absurd moment, like something that ought to be painted rather than lived through. Is that a threat? It's a fact. I'm telling you a fact. Then we understand each other. She held his gaze. Thank you for coming in person. It was more honest than the column, at least. He stood in the center of her room for another moment. She watched something move through his expression, something that wasn't quite guilt and wasn't quite regret, and was perhaps the closest Damien Blackthorne came to either. And then he composed his face back to its governance, turned, and walked to the door. He stopped with his hand on the frame. For what it's worth, he said, without turning around, I did not want it to happen this way. I know, she said. That's almost the worst part. He left. She stood at the window and listened to his footsteps on the stairs, measured, unhurried, the tread of a man who had done what he came to do and was proceeding to the next item, until they faded into the building's ambient sounds, and then into silence. Then she sat down on the floor beside the writing desk, not dramatically, just because her legs had decided they'd had enough of holding her up, and pressed the heels of her hands against her eyes, and stayed like that for a while, breathing in the particular smell of her rented rooms, coal fire, and old wood, and the faint ghost of the previous tenant's lavender water, while she worked through what had just happened. She had the documents. She had signed deeds and bank records and a letter in Damien's own hand that would, if produced, make the truth of the Blackthorne finances impossible to deny. She had saved them, saved the estate, saved his name, saved the bloodline's dignity, at a cost she had paid without expectation of return, because she had, in the particular foolishness of 23-year-old love, genuinely wanted to. She had not asked for acknowledgement. She had not asked for credit. She had asked, in the end, for nothing at all, and it had cost her everything anyway. The floor was cold through her skirt. She stayed on it longer than was strictly necessary. That evening, Eveline went through her papers. She had kept them, all of it, every document, in a locked cedar box beneath the floorboards of her dressing room because she was not, whatever Damien's narrative about her suggested, a naive woman. She had kept them partly out of instinct, partly out of some cold, practical corner of herself that had recognized, even at the height of what she'd felt for him, that the Blackthorn household was not a place where women were thanked for their generosity. She had kept them and not looked at them in 14 months, and had tried, with limited success, to pretend they were simply an artifact of a chapter that was over. She laid them out on the writing desk now. Deed transfers, bank correspondence, the record of the jewelry sale, her mother's rubies, the pearl set her father had brought back from Colombo, the diamond earrings she'd worn to her first London ball, a letter in Damien's handwriting that said, among other things, "Without this, the family cannot survive the quarter. I trust your discretion completely." The last 4 words underlined. She read them all the way through and sat with the knowledge that this, spread across a solicitor's desk or a courtroom table or the front page of a different newspaper, would be enough. More than enough. It would not merely correct the record. It would invert it entirely. It would take everything that had been done to her this morning and reverse the angle of it and bury the Blackthorn name under the weight of its own exposed hypocrisy. She could do that. She had the tools. She sat there in the lamplight and understood completely that she had the tools. She sat with that knowledge for a long time, and then she packed the documents back into the cedar box and put it under the floorboards and put the floorboard back and stood in her dressing room and breathed. She was not going to do it. Not tonight. Not in this state. Not in response to a morning that had taken something from her that she hadn't finished understanding yet. She was not going to make decisions about weapons while the wound was still fresh, because she knew, she had always known, it was one of the things that had drawn her to him and was now costing her, that decisions made in the first hour of pain rarely produce outcomes you can live with. She went to bed. She didn't sleep for a long time. She lay in the dark and thought about the solicitor, old Mr. Vane, who had handled her family's affairs since before her father's death, and who had been present at enough of the financial transactions that his testimony, if it ever came to that, would be significant. She thought about the specific social architecture of what had been done to her today, the precision of it, the preemptive nature, the way it was designed not just to damage her, but to discredit her in advance, to ensure that any account she offered would be filtered through the story they'd already told about who she was. Damien had not simply hurt her. He had constructed an environment in which she couldn't be believed. That was the part that kept circling back. Not the betrayal itself, which was comprehensible, even, she forced herself to think the word, logical in its cold architecture. But the specific nature of it, the surgical removal of her credibility as a preemptive measure, that was not the act of a man who had weighed the situation and made a hard choice. That was the act of a man who had mapped every contingency and neutralized each one. He had thought about her. He had planned for her. He had thought about her specifically enough and long enough to design her silencing in advance. She lay with that in the dark and felt, underneath the grief and the rage and the particular loneliness of someone who has just discovered the precise limits of what they meant to another person, something else beginning to form. It was not a plan yet. It was barely even a thought. It was the earliest possible version of a decision, just the outline of a shape, just the first suggestion of a direction. She let it sit there without touching it, and eventually she slept. 3 days later, she was walking in Green Park when she saw them. She had been trying to impose some normalcy on the wreckage of her social life, taking the walks she usually took, running the errands she usually ran, presenting to the city the same surface she always had, which was partly pride and partly the practical recognition that visible distress would be read as confirmation of everything the column had suggested. So she walked in the mornings, and she went to her dressmaker, and she responded to the correspondence that didn't disappear with the same composure she brought to the correspondence that arrived. And she held herself together with the particular discipline of someone who has decided that the shape of their life is not going to be determined by someone else's decision to reshape it. She was thinking about the Wiltshire property, still thinking about the solicitor's letter, still working through the logistics of a future that was being rapidly forced into new configurations. When she came around the curve of the path near the Buckingham Palace end of the park, and there they were, Damien and Cecilia Whitmore. She had seen Cecilia before, at a distance, at events. Seen her and looked at her with the complicated attention of someone who understands that a person can be both innocent and implicated. Cecilia was the heiress to the Whitmore textile fortune, a fortune built on northern mills and the kind of aggressive business acumen that the aristocracy found simultaneously vulgar and necessary. She was 22, fair, pretty in the specific way that good grooming and excellent dressing could construct, and there was nothing about her face, as Eveline looked at it now, that suggested anything other than a young woman who had been told an incomplete story about the man walking beside her and had had no reason to look for the rest of it. She was looking up at Damien with an expression that Eveline recognized from memory, the particular way a woman's face opens when she is in the presence of a man she trusts completely, the specific transparency of it, the letting down. Eveline stopped on the path. They hadn't seen her yet. They were 10 yards away, walking at the leisurely pace of people who own the space they move through, Damien saying something that made Cecilia laugh. A light, genuine sound that carried through the cold air with the quality of something that hadn't yet learned caution. Eveline stood on the gravel path and watched Damien Blackthorne walk with his future wife through the autumn-stripped trees of Green Park, and felt the specific anguish of seeing clearly, seeing what he was, what he'd done, what he would do, and being unable, for reasons she still couldn't entirely articulate to herself, to stop what was happening. He saw her. It was a moment she would turn over in her memory for a long time afterward, examining its components, the precise instant when his eyes moved from Cecilia's face to the path ahead and found Eveline standing there in her dark coat, not 15 steps away. His expression did not change. That was the remarkable part. Any other man would have faltered, a hesitation, a tightening, something. Damien Blackthorne looked at the woman he had destroyed 3 days prior, and his face maintained, with absolute precision, the pleasant composure of a morning walk. He inclined his head. A formal acknowledgement. Correct, minimal, appropriate to the social register of a duke encountering a woman of uncertain reputation in a public park. Cecilia followed his gaze. Her eyes found Eveline's face, and Eveline watched the girl run through the quick social calculation. Who is this? What do I know about her? What is the appropriate response? And land on a polite, uncertain smile. Good morning, Cecilia said, because she was well-raised and didn't know better. Good morning, Eveline said, because she did. She walked past them. She didn't look back. She walked the length of the park at the same pace she'd been walking before. Not faster, not different. And only when she'd come out onto Constitution Hill and the park was behind her did she stop for a moment against the iron railing and press her palm flat against the cold metal and breathe. She stood there breathing until the cold settled through her glove and into her palm and became simply a physical fact rather than a management problem, and then she walked home. October ended. November arrived with the particular London nastiness it specialized in. Not snow, not quite rain, just a persistent wet gray that got into everything and sapped the light from rooms that had adequately lit in October. Eveline packed 2 trunks. She had decided, in the quiet arithmetic of the weeks since the column, that London was no longer serving a purpose she recognized as legitimate. The friends who'd vanished would not return. The ones who hadn't vanished were navigating their own social precarity too carefully to be genuine company. The city had narrowed around her in ways that were not going to widen again on the basis of time or patience or correct behavior. She was not running. She needed to be clear about that in her own mind because the distinction mattered to her in a way that was difficult to explain but absolutely load-bearing. Running was a response to threat. What she was doing was a calibration, a recognition that a particular environment had become actively hostile and that the intelligent response was not to continue presenting herself to it in hopes of different treatment, but to remove herself and build somewhere with different foundation. She was going north. She had family property in Yorkshire, a modest estate her father had purchased in one of his more optimistic commercial periods. Not grand, not fashionable, but real and entirely hers, and far enough from London that she could reconstruct a version of her days that didn't require constant navigation of a world that had decided to read her as its villain. She had told almost no one. Mrs. Hartley, the solicitor. A woman named Agnes Marsh, who had been her mother's friend and was now simply her friend, one of the few people whose correspondence had not shifted in register over the past month, who had sent a note saying, "I know what I know about you, and I know that column is wrong, and I will say so to whoever requires hearing it," which Eveline had read 4 times and then folded carefully and kept. She was standing in the dressing room, trunks half packed, the cedar box back under the floorboard for now, to be transferred by the solicitor once she'd arrived and established herself. When there was a knock at the outer door, not the urgent rap of Mrs. Hartley's nephew, a different knock, controlled, deliberate, each contact with the wood metered. She knew the knock. She stood in the dressing room for a moment. Then she went to the outer room and opened the door. Damien was alone. No footman, no social architecture of accompaniment. Just him in a charcoal coat, the collar slightly wet from whatever the sky had been doing in the last hour. His face composed in a configuration she hadn't seen before. Not the governance of their last meeting, and not the park's social neutrality. Something closer to exhausted, which was perhaps the most alarming thing she'd ever seen on his face, because he was a man who did not let exhaustion show. She didn't open the door wider. She stood in the frame and looked at him. "I'm leaving tomorrow," she said. "If you've come to ask me something, you should ask it now." He looked at her. Something moved through his eyes that she found she didn't want to read too carefully. "I know about the solicitor," he said. The air in the hallway was very still. "Which solicitor?" she said, because she wanted to hear him say it. "Vane, I know he's been looking at the property records. The originals." His voice was level, but there was something under it. Not fear. Damien Blackthorne didn't do fear in any register she'd been able to detect. But something adjacent to it, a controlled awareness of a situation edging outside his containment. "I know what he's found. He's my solicitor," she said. "He finds things for me because I ask him to." "Eveline." He said her name differently this time, not the gentled version from their last meeting, something raw, less managed. "What are you planning to do?" She looked at him in the doorway of her rooms on a wet November morning with her trunks half packed behind her and the cedar box under the floorboard and 5 years of London society assembled and dissolved around the question he was asking. And she said the thing that was most completely true. "I haven't decided yet." She watched it land, watched him understand. And he did understand. She could see it moving through him. That this was not a threat and not a reassurance. That she was telling him the exact truth. She hadn't decided. She had the tools and the proof and the testimony, and she had been carrying all of it for a month in the particular stillness of someone who doesn't move while they're still thinking, and she hadn't decided. And that undecidedness was the most honest thing she could offer him. And somehow she could see that was worse than either answer would have been. "The engagement is announced next week," he said. "I read the papers. Whatever you're considering, Eveline, Cecilia she's not part of this. She doesn't know." "I know she doesn't know." She heard the edge come into her voice for the first time in this conversation. "I saw her face in the park. I know exactly what she doesn't know, Damien. I'm aware of how completely she doesn't know." "Then you understand why I understand everything you're asking me to understand." She gripped the doorframe. "I understand that she's innocent, and I understand that the family's future is involved, and I understand that this is enormously complicated, and I understand that your position is very difficult." Each sentence came out slightly harder than the one before it. "What I'm less clear on is why any of those things are my responsibility to manage, since you did such a thorough job of ensuring that I'd have nothing left to lose." He was quiet for a moment. "I'm not asking you for mercy," he said. "I don't think I've earned the right to ask you for that." "No," she said. "You haven't. I'm asking you." He stopped. Something shifted in his face, some internal structure giving way slightly. "I'm telling you that Cecilia Whitmore is 22 years old and has done nothing to deserve what will happen to her if this comes apart." The rain had started again outside, the light persistent kind, more mist than rain, barely audible. It blurred the window behind him into gray. Eveline stood in her doorway and looked at the man who had made her into a cautionary tale and felt the full weight of what he was asking. Not articulated, not dressed in logic or appeal, just the plain weight of it, and felt, alongside it, something else. Not forgiveness. Something much colder and more structurally interesting than forgiveness. a recognition of the full shape of what had been built here, what was still being built, how many pieces were still moving and in what directions. She was not going to answer him tonight. She knew that, and from the look on his face, he was beginning to know it too. "I'm leaving tomorrow," she said again. "I suggest you do what you came here to do before the announcement, Damien. Whoever you need to speak to, whatever you need to arrange. Do it now. Because I'm not making any promises about what happens in 6 months or a year or 5 years when the truth has had more time to get comfortable." She held his gaze. "And the next time you come to my door," she said quietly, "make sure you have something to offer that's worth opening it for." She closed the door. She stood on her side of it and listened for the sound of him leaving. But for a long moment, longer than she expected, there was no sound at all. Just the silence of a man standing on the other side of a closed door, and outside the soft hiss of London rain on wet stone, and the distant sound of a city that was going to keep moving regardless of what either of them decided. Then his footsteps. The stairs. Gone. Eveline stood with her hand on the door and breathed. And then she went back into the dressing room and finished packing her trunks, working by lamplight with the careful efficiency of someone who has decided that the present is not the right place to feel things, and who has somewhere to be by morning. The cedar box stayed under the floorboard. She would send for it when she was ready. What she didn't know, what she couldn't have known, as she folded dresses and wrapped her remaining jewelry in cotton wool and tried to build tomorrow into something she could step into, was that old Mr. Vane had found something else in those records. Something that hadn't been in the documents she'd given him. Something sealed, bearing the Blackthorn crest, and a date 2 months before the first debt had ever been mentioned to her. Something that would change, entirely and irreversibly, what she understood about why it had happened. The letter was in Vane's locked cabinet, addressed to Damien's father, and the first line read, "She must never know the full extent of what was asked of her." The letter stayed in Vane's cabinet for 11 days. Eveline didn't know about it yet. She was in Yorkshire, learning the grammar of a different life. The estate her father had left her in the northern countryside was called Ashwick. Not grand, not the kind of property that warranted mention in the social registers, but solid in the way that things built without pretension tend to be solid, with thick stone walls that held warmth against the November wind, and a view from the upper rooms of moorland that stretched far enough to make London feel like something that had happened to someone else. The house needed work. The gardens had gone wild in the 3 years since she'd last sent a caretaker. The kitchen range smoked when the wind came from the northeast. She threw herself into all of it with the focused intensity of someone who has discovered that physical problems are a tremendous relief after a prolonged encounter with the kind that can't be nailed back into place. She hired locally, a housekeeper named Mrs. Brennan, who had opinions about everything and expressed them without apology. 2 groundsmen, a girl for the kitchen. She walked the property lines in the mornings with mud on her boots and made lists in a small leather notebook and felt, incrementally, the particular sensation of weight distributing differently. Not lifting, not gone, but rearranged across a larger structure. She didn't think about Damien, or rather, she thought about him in the way you think about a complicated piece of machinery you've decided to leave in a locked room. You're aware it's there. You don't open the door. The letter arrived on a Tuesday. Mr. Vane's handwriting on the envelope, his careful, slightly antiquated script, and inside a single page in his hand, and behind it sealed with a wax impression she recognized as the old Blackthorn family crest, the original document. Vane's note was brief. Miss Ashcroft, I have debated sending this for 11 days. I have concluded that you have the right to know what was asked of you, even if the asker never intended you to. The enclosed was among documents filed with the Blackthorn Estate's private solicitor in the spring of 1887. I obtained a copy through means I will explain in person if you wish. Read it when you are ready. I would suggest sitting down. She sat down. She read it. The letter was addressed to the late Duke, Damien's father, Edmund Blackthorn, and it was written in a hand she didn't recognize, formal and tight, the handwriting of a man who chose his words with the awareness that they might be kept. It laid out, in the specific language of people who understand how much precision matters when arranging things that cannot be undone. The proposal. The family needed a particular sum. They had identified a source. The source was unaware of the full extent of the need. The source was, and here the language shifted, became almost clinical in its detachment, Sufficiently attached to the heir to make voluntary contribution likely, provided the request was managed carefully and the full picture withheld. The full picture. Evelyn sat with the letter in her hands and read it 3 times. She read it until the words stopped being words and became simply information that was rearranging the internal structure of everything she thought she'd understood. She had believed, she had built the last 14 months on the belief, that what had happened to her was a betrayal. That Damien had used her love and her resources and then discarded her when a better option appeared. That was the story. That was the shape of the wound she'd been carrying. Ugly, yes. Devastating, yes. But comprehensible. Human in its selfishness. The kind of thing that happens between people who meant something to each other before the arithmetic of survival overruled the arithmetic of feeling. This was not that. This was a plan. Drawn up before she and Damien had been together long enough for her to call it love, before she'd made a single financial decision on his behalf, before she'd sold a single piece of her mother's jewelry. Someone, and the letter bore no signature, only the blackthorn crest, had looked at her and seen not a woman but a mechanism, had calculated her attachment, her generosity, her blind spot, and had built a procedure around it, provided the full picture was withheld. She set the letter on the table. She pressed her hands flat on either side of it. Outside, Mrs. Brennan was saying something sharp to one of the groundsmen about the state of the kitchen garden, her voice carrying through the stone walls with the cheerful authority of a woman who expects the world to comply with her assessments. Evelyn looked at the letter. She breathed. She had thought she was a casualty of circumstance, of a man choosing self-preservation over loyalty. That was survivable. That was a story with human dimensions. What this letter described was something else, a structure, a design, a decision made about her before she'd made any decisions of her own. Someone had looked at a 23-year-old woman who'd recently lost both parents and had no one in London she fully trusted and had said, "There's the mechanism. Use it carefully." The rage that came up in her was different from anything she'd felt in the drawing room on Cavendish Square, different from the cold fury of watching Damien walk in the park with his future wife. This was quieter, deeper. The kind of anger that doesn't need to move because it has already decided it will wait as long as it takes. She picked up the letter. She carried it to the cedar box, which now lived on the shelf in her dressing room rather than under the floorboard, because she was in Yorkshire and no one was coming through her floor. She put it with the other documents. She locked the box. Then she sat down at her writing desk and wrote to Mr. Vane. And the letter she wrote was not about revenge, and not about exposure, and not about the engagement announcement that had run in every London paper 3 days prior. It was about process, timelines, the specific chain of custody required to make a collection of documents legally unimpeachable. She wrote it with the handwriting of someone who has stopped feeling things in a way that disrupts function, and has started feeling them in a way that informs strategy instead. She posted it that afternoon. She walked the moorland after, alone, in the November wind, until her face was raw, and her legs were tired, and her mind had been scoured down to something clean and workable. When she got back, Mrs. Brennan had made something involving root vegetables and a serious amount of black pepper, and Evelyn ate it at the kitchen table rather than the dining room, and listened to Mrs. Brennan's views on the structural deficiencies of the garden wall, and felt, underneath everything, the bedrock of her own continuity. She was still here. They had not finished her. That was the thing they'd miscalculated. Whoever had written that letter, whoever had decided she was a mechanism rather than a person. Mechanisms, once used, are discarded. People, once used, tend to notice what was done to them. She was going to take her time. She was going to build something they couldn't knock down. And when she was ready, when the documents were properly witnessed and the chain of custody was unimpeachable and old Mr. Vane had assembled what he was assembling, she was going to walk back into London society, not as the woman they'd made into a warning, but as the one holding the archive of what they'd actually done. Not yet. But the shape of it was clear now, and the shape was enough. 6 weeks after Eveline left London, Damien Blackthorne stood in the Whitmore townhouse drawing room on Berkeley Square and looked at his future father-in-law across a distance of 8 feet and a more significant distance of everything else. Reginald Whitmore was 61, built like something that had been compressed under long pressure into its current density, with the hands of a man who had actually worked mills before he owned them, and the eyes of someone who applied that same operational intelligence to everything, including the people in his drawing room. He was not aristocracy. He had bought his way into proximity to it through his daughter's marriage, and he was entirely clear-eyed about this transaction, which Damien had initially found refreshing and was finding increasingly inconvenient. The column worked, Whitmore said. He was standing at the window with a glass of port he wasn't drinking. That woman's gone quiet. Cecilia doesn't know anything, and I intend to keep it that way. That's my intention as well, Damien said. Your intentions? Whitmore said the word the way you'd test ice before putting your weight on it. I'll be direct with you, Blackthorn, since we've established I'm paying for directness. The announcement is made. The settlements are drawn. Cecilia is... He paused, something moving behind his eyes. Cecilia is happy. I intend for her to remain that way. Mr. Whitmore, I'm not finished. The man turned from the window. He was shorter than Damien by several inches, which he handled by taking up proportionally more of whatever room he was in. I did my research on your family before this arrangement was proposed, all of it, including the parts your family solicitor didn't include in the formal disclosure. The room was very still. Damien held Whitmore's gaze and kept his face where he needed it to be, and said nothing, because the move right now was to let the man finish rather than react to where he appeared to be going. I know about the debts, Whitmore said. I know about the timeline of them. I know about the property transfers in '87. He paused, watching Damien's face with the attention of someone reading a balance sheet. I don't know the source of the funds that kept your family afloat for those 2 years. Yet. But I know you had a source, and I know that source wasn't your own estate. The family made certain arrangements. Don't. One word, flat and complete. Don't arrange language for me. I didn't build 3 mills from nothing by accepting arranged language. I'm telling you what I know, and I'm telling you the next thing I'm going to find out. And what I want from you right now is the measure of whether you're the kind of man who'll tell me himself or the kind who'll make me dig it up. The clock on the mantelpiece made a sound. The fire in the grate was the primary source of warmth in a room that didn't need it to be. The heating worked perfectly well. It was a room that had been furnished to impress people who judged rooms, and Damien had spent enough of his life in rooms like this to be unimpressed by them. And he looked at Reginald Whitmore in the middle of it and understood that this was not a man making a social maneuver. This was a man who had already done the math and wanted to see whether Damien would lie to him about it. There was a private arrangement, Damien said. The details are complex. Simplify them. A long moment. The fire. A woman, Damien said. Someone with whom I had a personal association. She had resources. She contributed voluntarily. He heard how it sounded as he said it and watched Whitmore's face for the response and saw exactly what he'd expected to see there. Voluntarily, Whitmore repeated. She understood the situation. The full situation? Damien said nothing. Whitmore turned back to the window. His port glass was still untouched. I've read the column, the Ashcroft woman. Yes. She left London. Yes. And she stayed quiet. So far. Whitmore turned sharply at that. Not dramatically, just the precise pivot of a man recalibrating the weight of a word. So far, he repeated. That's an interesting qualifier from a man who's getting married in 4 months. I don't anticipate. You didn't anticipate whatever she knows either, apparently. Whitmore walked to the desk in the corner of the room, heavy mahogany, substantial, the desk of a man who makes decisions rather than drafts them for review, and set his glass down on it. He didn't look at Damien while he spoke. Here is what I need you to understand, Blackthorn. I am purchasing an alliance with your name and your bloodline because those things have value in certain rooms that my name doesn't currently open. I understand that transaction completely, and I am not under any illusions about its nature. What I am not purchasing is problems. What I am not paying for is the management of a situation you created before I was part of the equation. The situation is managed. Is it? Not a question. He picked up the glass, looked at it, put it back down. Because what I'm hearing when you say, so far, is that a woman who has reason to want your name destroyed is currently in possession of whatever she had to hold over you, sitting quietly in the countryside, and you're not certain what she's doing with her time. The accuracy of it was the thing. Damien had learned, in 34 years, to manage other people's proximity to accurate assessments of his situation. He had not found Reginald Whitmore particularly manageable. "I'll handle it," he said. "You've said that." Whitmore finally looked at him. "I need you to do it. Because if whatever she knows reaches Cecilia before the wedding, or during it, or any point after, I don't care about your name, Blackthorn. I care about my daughter. And my daughter's happiness is not a collateral casualty I'm prepared to accept in service of your family's history." The threat in it was entirely implicit and entirely clear. Damien held it in his chest. The pressure of it. The specific quality of pressure that came from someone who had, in fact, calculated that they could end something you'd built, and breathe through it the way he'd learned to breathe through things when he was 17, and his father had explained to him in the same formal drawing room register what the family needed him to do with his personal life for the next decade. You take the calculation in. You don't show what it costs. You decide what you're going to do about it, and you do that instead of showing what you feel about it. "Understood," he said. Whitmore nodded once. "Good. Cecilia will be back from her cousin's by Thursday. She'd like to discuss the invitations with you." He moved toward the door, which meant the conversation was over on his terms rather than Damien's. "I'll see you at dinner Friday." He left. Damien stood in the drawing room with the fire and the untouched port glass and the clock, and allowed himself, for exactly the time it took to draw 3 slow breaths, to feel the full weight of the position he was in. Then he picked up his coat and his hat and walked out into the London evening and stood on the pavement of Berkeley Square looking at the plane trees stripped bare by November, their branches black against a sky the color of tarnished silver, and thought about a cedar box and a woman in the northern countryside and the specific geometry of a situation that kept refusing to close. He pulled on his coat. He walked. He sent a man north, not to approach her. He wasn't a fool, and approaching her directly again had demonstrated its limits. He sent a man to report, to establish what her days looked like, whether she was in contact with anyone in London, whether the solicitor Vane had made any movements that suggested official proceedings were being prepared. The report came back in 10 days. She was running the estate, hiring, rebuilding, moving through her days with the systematic purposefulness of someone making something permanent. She had met with no one socially outside the local village. She had received correspondence, but her post was not accessible. She had walked the moors every morning in weather that would keep most people indoors. The last detail arrived in the report with no particular emphasis, just an item among items. And it was this. She had met twice with a local magistrate named Fallow, ostensibly regarding boundary disputes with adjacent property. His man described the meetings as brief, professional, unremarkable. Damien read that item twice. Then he set the report down and sat with it. A local magistrate. Twice. Regarding boundaries. He was a man who had spent 34 years reading the subtext in other people's reasonable explanations, and what he read here was not boundary disputes. He wrote to his own solicitor that evening. He needed to know 2 things: the legal requirements for introducing sealed private documents as evidence in a civil suit, and the current professional standing and recent case history of a Mr. Gerald Vane, solicitor, formerly of Gray's Inn. He sent the letter. He went to bed. He lay in the dark of his room in the Blackthorn townhouse. His townhouse, which he'd almost lost, which Evelyn's money had kept, and looked at the ceiling and thought about the letter he knew existed. He knew because he'd found, 3 months after his father's death, a copy in the estate papers, had read it, had understood, reading it, something about his father that he'd spent a long time not looking directly at, had locked it away in the particular internal cabinet he maintained for things that required containment rather than examination. He had not written it. That needed to be said, even if only inside his own head where no one could cross-examine the claim. He had not written it. His father had managed the arrangement, had made the decision about approach and disclosure, and what the heir's attachment to an unconnected young woman of good instincts and limited social protection could be leveraged into. Damien had known the money was coming from somewhere. He had not asked with the intensity that might have produced an answer he didn't want. That was the thing he could not entirely look at. Not the betrayal, which had its own cold logic, and which he'd made his own choices around. The not asking. The deliberate architecture of his own ignorance. The decision to understand that something was happening that he didn't fully understand. And to find the non-understanding convenient. He looked at the ceiling and breathed and let that knowledge sit in his chest the way it sometimes sat, in the quiet hours, without the managed compression of daylight. She had never asked him for an explanation. Not then, not in the drawing room, not at the door in November. She had given him space to confess things, and he had used the space to negotiate instead. He thought about the way she'd said, "I haven't decided yet." The specific quality of it, not a threat, not a reassurance, just a woman telling him the exact shape of her current position and giving him nothing to calculate against. He had thought, in the months since, that she was simply recovering, processing, that the silence from Yorkshire was the silence of someone rebuilding. He had let himself believe this because it was more comfortable than the alternative. Lying in the dark with his solicitor's letter already posted, he allowed himself to stop believing it. She wasn't recovering. She was preparing. And somewhere in a locked cedar box in a stone house in Yorkshire, next to everything she already had, there was now a letter with his family crest on it that told a story even worse than the one she'd been trying not to tell. He didn't know when she would move. He didn't know what she was planning. He understood, in the way you understand the weight of a door before you push it, that if she had found that letter, the situation had permanently changed in ways that his ability to manage it had not. He was still here. That was what he held on to when everything else went dark and analytical. He was still here, and he had time, and he had resources, and he had a mind that had spent 3 decades learning to identify leverage before other people noticed it existed. He had something else, too. Something he hadn't wanted to look at, but was looking at now, in the particular honesty that the dark and the ceiling and the knowledge of what he'd done could produce in him. He had done something that could not be undone. Not the column, not the engagement, something older and more foundational than those. He had looked at a woman who had made herself vulnerable to him in the specific way that only happens when someone trusts you with their actual self, and he had used the vulnerability and called it necessity and moved on. He had not wanted her to know. Not because the knowing would give her leverage, though it would, but because there was a version of Damien Blackthorne that had existed in the time when she didn't know, and that version was easier to inhabit. She knew now. He felt the door of that easier version closing, felt its weight, and lay in the dark while it shut. His solicitor's response arrived 4 days later. The content regarding evidentiary requirements was detailed and not encouraging. The content regarding Mr. Gerald Vane was brief. Vane had, 2 weeks prior, made a formal application to appear as a witness before a civil review panel. The subject of the proceeding was listed under the procedural category reserved for cases involving fraudulent misrepresentation in the transfer of private assets. Not a boundary dispute, not yet public, but in the formal record, documented, dated, moving. Damien read it standing in the hallway where his footman had handed him the envelope, still in his coat from the street. He read it and stood and felt the specific gravity of something reaching the point where it could no longer be negotiated with in the way it could be negotiated with before it had been made official. He thought about Cecilia, her face in the park, that open, unguarded expression, the laugh that hadn't learned caution. Her father's voice. "My daughter's happiness is not a collateral casualty I'm prepared to accept. The wedding in 4 months, the settlement signed." He thought about his name, the estate, the things his father had built and leveraged and ultimately put on the back of a woman who'd never known the full weight she was carrying. He folded the letter. He put it in his coat pocket. He stood in the hallway of his house with his hat still on and understood that the geometry of his available moves had just reduced to something that required a choice he'd been deferring since November. He could go to her. He could go before this became a formal proceeding, and he could lay down everything, the full account, the letter, his father's role and his own, all of it, and give her the truth without calculation, without management, without the negotiating posture he'd brought to every previous conversation. He could do that. He understood, standing in his hallway, that it was the only move left that had any integrity in it. He also understood that it was the one move that gave him nothing. No leverage, no containment, no certainty of outcome. He would go to Yorkshire and hand Evelyn Ashcroft the full picture that had been withheld from her, and she would do whatever she was going to do with it, and he would have no instrument of management, no architecture of control, nothing but the plain fact of what he was telling her, and whatever she decided to believe about his reasons for telling it. He stood in the hallway and breathed. Then he walked to the study and sat at the desk and wrote a letter to the estate manager in Yorkshire about scheduling a visit to address a property matter, which was the cover he would use and the only dishonest thing about the trip. And he wrote it in the clean, managed hand of a man who has made a decision and is moving through the actions that follow it. He sealed it. He gave it to the footman. He sat alone in the study with the lamp and the fire and the silence of a house that had been kept alive by money that wasn't his, and felt the particular quality of a man who has run out of arrangements and is about to do something he cannot take back. The letter to Yorkshire was already gone. His horse would be ready at 6 in the morning. The roads north were passable. He'd done the journey before, knew its rhythm, knew the stone house on the moorland edge and the view of hills from the upper windows. What he didn't know, what he was going to find out in 2 days' time, standing in her doorway with everything managed stripped away, was that when he arrived, Mr. Gerald Vane would already be there, and Vane wouldn't be alone. The roads north were worse than he remembered. Damien had left London before first light, the city still grey and unlit behind him as his horse found its rhythm on the post road, and he'd ridden through the kind of December morning that didn't so much begin as simply become marginally less dark. 6 hours of it. The flat Midlands giving way to the rougher country, the sky dropping lower as the land rose, the wind finding new angles to come at him from, as Yorkshire asserted itself against the South's pretensions. He stopped once to rest the horse and drink something hot at a coaching inn that smelled of wet wool and fried fat, and he sat at a corner table and looked at nothing and felt the particular interior weather of a man who has made a decision and is now living in the space between making it and whatever comes next. He had not sent word ahead. That was intentional. He needed to arrive before she had time to construct a position, and he needed Vane's presence, if Vane was indeed there, to be something he encountered rather than something he was prepared for. He needed, for perhaps the first time in his adult life, to walk into a room without a managed surface. He arrived at Ashwick at 2:30 in the afternoon. The estate looked different from when he'd last seen it, which had been briefly and from a distance years prior, when it had been the neglected property of a merchant's daughter who hadn't yet decided what to do with it. It looked lived in now. The drive had been cleared, the stone walls along the approach repaired with fresh mortar, smoke rising straight from 2 chimneys against the flat winter sky. Someone had planted something along the front, bare stalks now, but planted with intention, the kind of systematic improvement that meant someone was thinking in seasons. He dismounted at the gate. A groundsman came out and looked at him with the frank assessment of the northern working man, which operated on different social scales than the London version, and found aristocratic bearing considerably less impressive. "I'm here to see Miss Ashcroft," Damien said. "She expecting you?" "No." The man looked at him a moment longer. "Wait here." He waited. The wind came off the moorland with the particular quality of wind that has been traveling a long way across open ground and has accumulated a kind of flat authority in the process. He stood with it and looked at the house and breathed. The groundsman came back. "She'll see you. Leave your horse." Mrs. Brennan met him at the door with the expression of a woman who had formed a complete opinion of him between receiving the news of his arrival and walking the 30 feet to the entrance, and had not formed it favorably. She took his coat with the efficiency of someone performing a courtesy they don't particularly feel and directed him down the main corridor toward the back of the house, toward what turned out to be a room that served as an office. Shelves of estate ledgers, a desk covered in correspondence, a fire burning with the serious intent of a room that is used rather than displayed. There were 3 people in it. Evelyn stood behind the desk. She was in dark wool, her hair simply arranged, and she was watching him cross the threshold with an expression that told him, in the first half-second, that his arrival was not the surprise he had calculated it would be. To her left, seated in a chair near the fire, Gerald Vane. 70 years old, built like a man who had once been substantial and had compressed with age into something dense and deliberate. He wore his professional gravity the way other men wore good coats, as a second nature entirely unremarkable to him. He looked at Damien with the clear, unperturbed gaze of a man who has been waiting for this specific entrance for some time. And to Vane's left, standing rather than seated, with his back partially to the fire and his arms at his sides in the specific posture of someone trying to look like he belongs in a room he has not earned his way into, Harlan Graves. Damien stopped walking. The room's temperature didn't change. The fire continued its business. Eveline continued to look at him with that unreadable steadiness. And Harlan Graves, who was 31, who had been Damien's personal secretary for 4 years, who had managed his correspondence and his calendar and his private financial records, and who Damien had trusted with the specific trust of a man who has vetted someone thoroughly and found them reliable, looked back at him with an expression that contained, if you knew how to read it, the very precise combination of calculation and preemptive justification that arrives on a person's face when they have already decided what they're doing and are in the process of becoming comfortable with it. Damien stood in the doorway and understood in the space between one breath and the next that he had not arrived before anything. He had arrived after. "Close the door," Eveline said. He closed it. He moved into the room, not to the desk, not toward Graves, to a position near the window that gave him sight lines to all three of them, which was what his body defaulted to in situations his mind was still catching up with. "How long?" he said. He directed it at Graves. Graves had the decency, or perhaps just the intelligence, not to perform ignorance about what was being asked. "Miss Ashcroft contacted me in November." The room absorbed that. The fire made a sound. "She contacted you," Damien said. "Through an intermediary initially." Graves's voice was controlled, but it had the slightly elevated quality of someone managing the adrenaline of a confrontation they'd rehearsed. The letter explained what she had, what she was prepared to do with it, and what she was prepared to offer in exchange for supplementary documentation from within the household. Supplementary documentation. Damien heard the phrase come out in a register that was very flat and very quiet, which was what his voice did under specific pressures that other registers couldn't contain. Eveline hadn't moved. She was watching him with the attention of someone who has been waiting a long time for a particular moment, and is now recording every detail of it for reasons that have nothing to do with satisfaction and everything to do with use. "The financial correspondence," Vane said from his chair, with the measured tone of a man reading into the record. "Between the late Duke and the family's principal creditors. The letters your father wrote to Mr. Graves regarding instructions for Miss Ashcroft's management. And the internal ledger from the household accounts for 1887 and 1888, which documents, in your late father's own hand, the receipt of funds from sources listed under the notation E.A. Personal. Mr. Graves provided copies to my office 11 days ago." 11 days. Damien stood at the window and worked through the arithmetic of it. He had sent his man to Yorkshire 3 weeks ago for a routine report. He had read about boundary disputes and morning walks, and received nothing that suggested Vane and Graves were sitting in the same room in this stone house with 11 days of his private household records between them. His man had missed it, either through incompetence or, and this was the thought that arrived with the particular cold of something that can't be unfelt, through something else. He looked at Graves. "Who else?" he said. "No one." Graves met his eyes. "This stays in this room until Miss Ashcroft decides otherwise." "And what does Miss Ashcroft want in exchange for that?" "That's not—" Graves started. "I'll answer that myself." Eveline's voice cut across the room cleanly, without heat, the way a straight line cuts across something curved. She moved from behind the desk and came to stand in the center of the room, equidistant from all of them, which was not an accident of positioning. "I want the truth, the complete version. Not managed, not arranged, all of it. Your father's role, your role, the name of whoever wrote that letter, and the exact amount of what was taken from me in total, including the assets I wasn't told I was contributing." Damien looked at her. "You know most of it. I know the shape of it. I want the details." She held his gaze without expression. "I want you to say it out loud in front of witnesses." The weight of it landed in the room like something dropped from height. Not loudly, the opposite. The way very heavy things land when they've been falling a long time and have exhausted their drama on the way down. He looked at Graves, who had the grace, at least, to look at the floor. He looked at Vane, who was observing with the professional detachment of a man who has seen the full range of what people do to each other and has learned to take nothing personally except the records. He looked at Eveline. Something had happened to his plan on the road north. The plan that had been about arriving unannounced and laying down an honest account on his own terms, in his own register, with the particular control of a man who chooses the moment of his own exposure. That plan was gone. It had been gone before he left London, as it turned out, dismantled by his own secretary over 11 days while he was composing letters in his study and thinking about how to manage a situation that was already several moves past his management. He had come to give her the truth. She had already taken it. The distinction was the kind of thing that would have mattered enormously to him 3 months ago. Standing in her office in Yorkshire with the moorland wind audible through the walls and his own treason standing 8 feet to his left, he found it mattered considerably less than he might have expected. "My father made the initial approach," he said. His voice came out level. He'd trained it to do that. It was one of the things he'd trained earliest and hardest, and it was one of the things he was least sure he was grateful for. "I was 28. The estate's debt position had become critical. Creditors who could no longer be deferred, obligations that would become public within 2 quarters. My father identified you as a possibility." "Say what you mean," Evelyn said. "He identified you as someone whose attachment to me could be redirected into financial contribution if the situation was presented to you in a way that made the contribution feel like your choice rather than an extraction." The room took it in. Graves was still looking at the floor. Vane had taken out a small notebook, the reflex of a man who records, and was writing. "And you," Evelyn said. "Your role. I knew it was happening." He said it without the prefix of justification, without the framing that would have made it easier to hear or easier to say. "I didn't design it. I didn't approach you with that intention, but I knew, by the time you made the first transfer, that my father had arranged the circumstances. And I didn't stop it, because you needed the money." "Because I needed the money." Silence. The fire. The wind. "The letter," she said. "The one that says I should never know the full extent of what was asked of me. Who wrote it?" A pause. "My father dictated it. His solicitor at the time, not Vane, a man named Carver who died in 1890, drafted it." "Was there instruction in it about the column, about what to do with me after the debt was resolved?" He looked at her. This was the part. This was the specific part he'd spent months not looking directly at. "There was a provision," he said. "In the event that the arrangement concluded, and in the event that any liability remained regarding your potential claims, there was a recommended approach to neutralizing that liability in advance." The column. Her voice didn't change. It was the absolute steadiness of it that was unbearable. "Your father wrote the plan for the column. He outlined the approach. I executed it." "You chose to execute it?" "Yes." The words sat in the room, small, clean, unavoidable. Evelyn breathed in through her nose. She didn't look away from him. She had the quality, in this moment, of a person who is very precisely not feeling the thing she is feeling, who has put it somewhere sealed and is accessing only the usable surface of herself. And he recognized it because he had spent 34 years doing exactly the same thing and had never expected to see it used against him with this degree of effectiveness. "The total," she said. Vane spoke from his chair, reading from his notebook. The number he named was larger than what Damien had held in his head. Not dramatically, not by orders of magnitude, but by enough that something moved across Damien's face that he couldn't fully contain, because the difference represented items he hadn't known were included, which meant his father had found ways to use her resources that he hadn't been told about, which meant the architecture of his own ignorance was larger than he'd calculated. Evelyn watched his face during this. She saw the thing he couldn't contain. She filed it. "You didn't know all of it," she said. "Not a question." "No." "That changes nothing." "I know." Graves shifted his weight near the fire and said, in the tone of a man who has been waiting for a pause to insert a practicality, "The documentation Mr. Vane has assembled is sufficient for civil proceedings. The question is what Miss Ashcroft intends to do with it." "The question," Damien said with a precision that made Graves close his mouth, "is why you're in this room at all." He turned to face his secretary fully for the first time since the initial shock of recognition, and brought to bear the full weight of what 4 years of close proximity to a man's private life gives you over him, which in this direction was considerable. "You had access to those records because I trusted you with them. You provided them to a party in an active legal situation involving your employer without notice or consent. That is not a gray area, Harlan." Graves met his eyes. There was something in them. Not quite guilt. Something adjacent to it. The expression of a man who made a calculation and is standing next to it without entirely enjoying the view. She told me what you'd done to her. So you made a moral decision with my private documents. Someone had to. The bitterness in it was real. Damien absorbed it and stood with it and felt the specific quality of what it was like to be on the receiving end of a betrayal, performed by someone who considers themselves to be doing the right thing, and found it was a different texture than he'd expected. Harder to dismiss. Not because Graves's reasoning was wrong, it wasn't particularly, but because the rightness of the reasoning didn't make the thing done to him any less done. This was, he understood, not an insight he was allowed to feel sorry for himself about. That particular irony was not available to him in this room. "Get out," he said to Graves. Graves looked at Eveline. She nodded once. He left. The door closed. 3 people now, the fire, the wind outside. Vane in his chair with his notebook closed. "What do you want?" Damien said to Eveline. Stripped of the architecture of management he usually brought to this question, stripped of the assessment of what she could be offered that would serve his interests, it came out simply as what it was. A genuine question from a man who has run out of leverage and is asking the room what happens next. "I want Cecilia Whitmore to know what she's marrying," Eveline said. The room shifted. He'd expected financial restitution. He'd expected public exposure, the documents, the solicitor's panel, the formal dismantling of his reputation in the specific surgical way that Vane's assembled record would accomplish. He'd prepared for those outcomes, had found the shape of his own ruin in them, and made a kind of cold peace with it. He had not expected this. "She doesn't know any of it," he said. "I know she doesn't." Eveline's voice was even. "That's the point. She's 22. Her life is about to be permanently attached to yours. She deserves to attach it with accurate information." She looked at him with a directness that had no performance in it, no anger, no satisfaction, just the clean line of a woman who has thought about something long enough to be certain of it. "I'm not doing this to her. You did this to her when you decided what she would and wouldn't know. I'm just reversing the decision. And if she stays with him anyway," Vane said from his chair, with the equanimity of a man making a procedural observation. "Women have stayed with men for worse-founded alliances." "That's her choice to make," Eveline said, with the full picture. Damien stood at the window and looked at the moorland through the glass. The flat brown winter expanse of it, colorless under the low sky. The kind of landscape that has no interest in what you're going through and applies a certain blunt clarifying pressure by virtue of its indifference, and felt, working through him, something he did not have a ready-built word for. He had managed things for 34 years. He had looked at situations and identified the available moves and executed the best available move and moved to the next situation. He had done this with the discipline of someone who understood that the alternative, feeling the full weight of every choice, carrying every cost forward, letting the accumulated damage of the decisions he made about other people actually land on him as damage, would make functioning impossible. He had been managing this situation for months, and the situation had, in the meantime, gathered itself into a configuration that left him standing in this room with no move available that wasn't also a cost he'd been trying to avoid since November. Tell Cecilia the truth. Watch the engagement dissolve, because Reginald Whitmore would pull his daughter from it the moment he had the full account, and Whitmore was not a man who accepted incomplete information twice. Lose the financial foundation the marriage represented. Face the formal proceedings Vane had already initiated with no countermeasure that didn't make everything worse, and do all of this not as a managed outcome but as a consequence. Not because he'd chosen the timing or the framing or the terms. Because a woman he'd spent 2 years carefully not giving the full picture to had spent December getting it from his own secretary and was now standing in front of him with the complete archive and the only remaining question being whether he would participate in what happened next or simply be happened to. He thought about his father. He thought about that letter. The cold procedural language of it, the way it described Eveline in the register of an asset rather than a person. He thought about being 28 and knowing what was happening and finding the not knowing convenient. He thought about what it felt like, right now, to be on the other side of a plan built around what someone didn't know about your intentions. "When?" he said. "I've written to her already." Evelyn said it the way you say a thing you've been holding for a long time and are ready to put down. Not with the documents? Not yet. A letter asking to meet. She hasn't responded. She won't respond to an unknown name. She'll respond to mine. She knows who I am. A pause, precise and deliberate. You made sure of that. He looked at her. For a moment, the management fell away entirely. Not by choice, not as a performed honesty, just as a consequence of standing in a room where it had nowhere to attach. He looked at her the way he might have looked at her if he had been, at any point, a different kind of man. I came here to tell you the truth, he said. I know it's too late for that to mean anything. It means something, she said. Her voice had shifted slightly. Not softer, just different, less constructed. It means you knew the truth was what this required, which is more than your father ever got to. She moved back behind her desk with the ease of a woman in her own house, in her own life, setting terms in a room that belongs to her. It doesn't change what happens now. I know. Cecilia gets the meeting. She gets the documents, through Vane's office, at the appropriate time. The proceedings continue regardless of what she decides about the engagement. She looked at him with that straight, undecorated attention. And you don't come to Yorkshire again without an invitation. He picked up his coat from the chair near the door where Mrs. Brennan had deposited it. He felt the weight of it, the damp cold still in the wool from the ride north, and stood with it in his hands for a moment. The letter, he said. My father's letter. I didn't write it. I know you didn't. She was already looking at the papers on her desk, already back in the business of her life, her actual life, the one she'd built here without him. That doesn't mean you didn't use it. He left. He walked through the corridor with Mrs. Brennan materializing from somewhere to open the front door without a word and closing it behind him with the precise, deliberate care of a woman who considers the symbolic possibilities of how doors are shut. He stood outside in the December wind. The groundsman was somewhere nearby with his horse. The sky was the color of old iron, and the moorland stretched away to the horizon in every direction with its flat, indifferent authority. Damien Blackthorne stood in front of a stone house in Yorkshire and understood, with the clarity that only arrives when all the available arrangements have been tried and found insufficient, that the version of himself that had walked into this house no longer had a future worth managing toward. The estate would survive, or it wouldn't. His name would survive, or it wouldn't. Cecilia would make her choice with the full picture, the one that had been withheld from her, the same way it had been withheld from Evelyn, and he would live with whatever shape that choice produced. He had spent his entire adult life learning how to be the man his father had built the estate around, the man who didn't ask questions he didn't want answered, the man who found the not knowing convenient. That man was standing in the cold outside a house he had no more claim on, with a horse and a long road south, and the specific vertiginous sensation of someone who has just had the ground removed from beneath a life they thought was solid. He could rebuild. That was the thing that arrived last, under everything else, not as comfort, but as the bare structural fact it was. He had the intelligence for it, and the constitution for it, and none of the other things he'd thought were necessary. The management, the arrangements, the careful architecture of what other people knew had turned out to be load-bearing. He mounted his horse. He turned it south. He didn't look back at the house, not because he was managing the gesture, but because there was nothing behind him now that he had any right to look at. What he didn't know, what he couldn't know, riding south through the December dusk with the weight of everything he'd built shifting on its foundations, was that Cecilia Whitmore had not received Eveline's letter. Her father had, and Reginald Whitmore, who had spent 40 years building an empire on the principle that you control information before information controls you, had read it, had sat with it for 3 days, and had made a decision. Not the decision Evelyn had intended, not the one Damien feared, something else entirely, something that would require all three of them to discover, simultaneously, that the man who had positioned himself as the transactions administrator had been running a different calculation from the beginning, one that needed all of them manageable, one that needed none of them talking to each other, and one that had just, with the arrival of Damien's horse in that Yorkshire courtyard, run out of room to stay hidden. Reginald Whitmore's letter arrived at Ashwick on a Thursday. Eveline was at the writing desk when Mrs. Brennan brought it in, not her usual correspondence desk in the study, but the smaller one in the front room she'd begun using for the estate accounts, because the study had become, in the weeks since Damien's visit, a room that felt too charged for ordinary work. She'd rearranged the furniture twice, and it hadn't helped. Some rooms absorb what happens in them and hold it in the walls regardless of where you move the chairs. She recognized the Whitmore seal before she opened it. She had done her research on all of them: Damien, his family's creditors, the solicitor Carver's estate, the secondary players in the financial arrangements of 1887. And she had included Reginald Whitmore in that research because a man who purchases an aristocratic alliance with his daughter's future is a man who understands leverage. And a man who understands leverage is a man you do not approach from the wrong angle. She had written to Cecilia. She had not written to Whitmore. She opened the envelope. The letter was 4 paragraphs. It was written in the hand of someone who dictates to a secretary and then reviews and revises with a pen. She could see where the original phrasing had been crossed through and replaced with something tighter, more compressed. The effect was of language that had been edited toward a particular pressure. The first paragraph acknowledged her letter to his daughter, which he had intercepted before Cecilia received it, and which he was retaining. He did not explain his reasoning for the interception. He offered no apology for it. The second paragraph informed her that he was aware of the documentation she had assembled and had been aware of its existence for longer than she might expect, and had formed his own views regarding its implications. He named specific documents, including the sealed letter with the blackthorn crest, with a specificity that meant he either had copies or had access to someone who did. She set the letter down. She picked it up again. The third paragraph was where the pressure arrived. Whitmore wrote, in the flat declarative style of a man who does not consider it necessary to imply what he can simply state, that he had spent the preceding months constructing his own parallel account of the Blackthorne family's financial history, cross-referenced with records she would not have had access to, and that this account contained information material to the proceedings Vane had initiated. Information that could either support those proceedings or complicate them substantially, depending on how the next several weeks were managed, depending specifically on whether Eveline Ashcroft chose to conduct her affairs in coordination with him or in ignorance of him. The fourth paragraph contained a time and a place. London. The Whitmore townhouse on Berkeley Square. Saturday, which was 2 days away. He would send a carriage for her if she required one. He would not require confirmation of her attendance. He seemed to take it as given. At the bottom, beneath the signature, a single handwritten edition in a different pen, added after the secretary's draft. Smaller, more personal, the writing of a man who wants you to know the words are his own. Your letter to my daughter showed restraint. It also showed intelligence. Those are rare in combination. Don't waste either by arriving late. Eveline sat with the letter for a long time. She thought about what it meant that he had the documents. She thought about what it meant that he'd had them long enough to cross-reference them with records of his own. She thought about his face as Damien had described it, obliquely, in the Yorkshire study, in the way Damien described things when he was being careful. The face of a man who applies mill owner's logic to human situations and finds nothing categorically different about them. She thought about his daughter, 22 years old, fair, laughing in the park with unguarded transparency, about to marry into a name that had been built on a foundation that multiple people in multiple rooms were now holding pieces of. She thought about the carriage he'd offered. She wrote back and said she didn't need the carriage. She arrived at Berkeley Square on Saturday at 11 in the morning, alone, in the hired cab she'd taken from the station, wearing the dark wool she'd worn to every significant meeting of the past 6 months because it was armor in the only sense she believed in. Not decoration, but structure. The clothing of someone who has somewhere to be and intends to remain standing when they get there. The townhouse was exactly what she'd expected. Grand without being ostentatious, the wealth of it expressed in quality rather than quantity. Good stone, good proportions, the restrained confidence of money that is old enough not to need announcement. A butler admitted her without the particular evaluative pause that aristocratic households deployed on visitors of uncertain status. Whitmore had apparently prepared his staff for a guest who arrived in a hired cab and was to be received without commentary. She was shown to the study, not the drawing room where Damien had stood 2 months ago looking at untouched port and being assessed. The study, a working room, substantial desk, 2 chairs positioned without the social geometry of receiving, just 2 chairs on the same level. bookshelves that showed actual use, a fire, a man standing in front of it with his hands behind his back, looking at her arrival the way he'd probably looked at every significant thing that had walked through his doors for 40 years, as information to be processed. "Miss Ashcroft," Whitmore said, "thank you for coming." "You didn't leave much of an alternative," she said. Something moved at the corner of his mouth. Not quite a smile. Acknowledgement, maybe. Recognition of a phrasing style he found usable. "Sit down." She sat. He sat. Between them, on the desk within reach, a folder of documents, thick, organized with the systematic care of someone who has spent decades understanding that the difference between a claim and a case is the quality of the paper underneath it. "You intercepted my letter to your daughter," she said. "I did." "That was not your right." "No," he agreed without particular agitation about the agreement. "It was a practical decision. She responds to information emotionally before she responds to it analytically. I needed time to understand the full picture before she had access to it. That required the letter to come to me first. You've had 6 months to understand the full picture. I've had the pieces I could acquire independently. You have pieces I don't. That's why you're here." He opened the folder and turned it toward her, not pushing it across, just turning it so she could see the top document. It was a letter she didn't recognize, addressed to a bank in Edinburgh, in a hand she'd never seen. "My independent research began before the engagement was announced. I needed to know what I was buying into. I found enough to know the family had been in serious financial difficulty. I did not find, at that time, the source of their recovery." He looked at her steadily. "That's where your documentation becomes relevant." She looked at the folder. She looked at him. "You're telling me you went forward with the engagement knowing the family had hidden financial problems." "I went forward with an incomplete picture, having concluded that the problems were historical and resolved. What I didn't know was how they were resolved or what the resolution had cost." He sat back in his chair with the ease of a man on his own ground. "I know now. Your letter to Cecilia was informative, even if she hasn't read it yet. And the documents Graves provided to Vane." A pause. Slight. "Yes. You have a copy." "Graves came to me," he said, with the flat delivery of a fact rather than a confession. "Before he went to you." Evelyn sat with that. The fire in the grate, the sound of London outside, muted, the particular urban murmur of a wealthy street on a weekend morning. She felt the room rearranging itself around a new piece of information, the way rooms do when the person speaking to you has just revealed that the map you were using was missing a territory. "He came to you first," she said, 3 weeks before he appeared in your solicitor's documentation." Whitmore looked at her without apology. "He wanted to know what it was worth. He's a practical man, Graves, more practical than loyal, as it turns out." "You paid him." "I compensated him for his time and his access. What he chose to do subsequently with the material was his own decision. You knew he was going to Vane. I expected it was likely." Whitmore crossed one leg over the other, unhurried, the posture of a man who has been 3 moves ahead of this conversation since it started. "I needed the proceedings to begin through your office rather than mine. The documentation is more useful as the testimony of a wronged party than as the research of a prospective father-in-law. Your standing in this gives it weight that mine wouldn't." The clarity of it was almost bracing. She sat in the chair in Reginald Whitmore's study and looked at the man who had positioned her as the instrument of his own investigation while allowing her to believe she was building an independent case, and felt the cold, comprehensive recognition of someone who has just found the outer wall of a structure she thought she was standing outside of. She had been in his calculation from the beginning, not as a person, as a mechanism. The same way she had been in the Blackthorn calculation from the beginning. The irony of it was not available to her right now. She filed it for later. "What do you want?" she said. "The same thing you want," he said. "The full truth in a room where it can't be managed. Public proceedings. Documented, witnessed, permanent." He looked at her with the directness of a man who has no use for the social lubricant of indirection. "I want my daughter to know what Blackthorn did, and I want his name to carry that knowledge forward, permanently, so that there is no version of his future that doesn't include what he cost you. You want to destroy him. I want to ensure he cannot rebuild what he built on dishonest foundations and call it something legitimate." He said it without heat. "That's not destruction. That's accuracy. Evelyn looked at him. She thought about what it would cost to work with this man, what it would require her to give him, what he would use it for, what she would have participated in. She thought about Cecilia's unguarded laugh in the park. She thought about the cedar box and the sealed letter and old Mr. Vane's careful notebook. She thought about Damien standing in her office saying, "I know it's too late for that to mean anything," and the particular quality of a man who has finally stopped managing and is just speaking. "There's a public gathering," Whitmore said when she'd been quiet long enough that the silence had communicated something. The winter court convening, the full aristocracy present. Blackthorn will attend. He has to. His family has held a seat at that gathering for 3 generations. If the documentation is presented there, with Vane as witness and the complete paper record available for inspection, it cannot be subsequently managed. It becomes part of the permanent record of a public proceeding. She looked at him. "You want to do it there, at the court?" "The documentation has been submitted to the presiding panel already," he said, and his voice was even and calm and contained the quiet precision of someone telling you what has already happened rather than what might happen. Vane filed the formal application 2 days ago. The hearing is scheduled for Thursday. You are named as the principal aggrieved party. He paused. "I submitted my supporting documentation as a secondary witness. Your name is on the proceeding, Miss Ashcroft. Mine is an annotation." The room was very still. She understood now why the carriage offer had been a courtesy rather than a pressure. She was not here to decide whether to participate. She was here to be informed that she already had, that her name and Vane's work and Graves's defection and Whitmore's 40 years of operational intelligence had been assembled into a proceeding that was already in motion, already filed, already scheduled, and that the only question remaining was whether she would walk into that room on Thursday as someone who understood what she was walking into or someone who arrived surprised. She breathed, slowly. Through the nose, the way she'd learned to breathe through things when her body wanted to move and her mind required stillness. "You should have told me," she said. "Yes," he said. "I should have." He said it with the same unornamented directness he'd applied to everything else. "I didn't because I needed your responses to Blackthorn's approaches to be genuine. If you'd known the full picture, your meetings with him would have had a different quality. The documents Vane assembled are more powerful because they were built from your actual process rather than a constructed one." She stood up. He watched her stand without moving, without the social adjustment of a man responding to a social signal. He watched her the way you watch weather. "I'll be at the proceeding," she said. "Not because you've arranged it, and not because your calculation required it. Because it's the right place for the truth to be said." She picked up her coat from the back of the chair. "But understand something. Whatever you've built around this, whatever outcome you're managing toward, I am not a mechanism in it. I am the person at the center of it. And if you handle me the way the Blackthorns handled me, I will find a way to make sure the proceeding includes a complete account of how you've operated, including Graves, including the interception of my letter, including every move you've made while presenting yourself as a bystander." Whitmore looked at her for a long moment. Then he nodded. Once. The nod of a man recalibrating an estimate upward. "Thursday," he said. 10 in the morning. She left. But she sent word to Vane that afternoon. He confirmed the filing. He confirmed the schedule. He told her in the careful language of a man who chooses his words with the knowledge that they might matter later, that the panel had already reviewed the primary documentation and found it sufficient to proceed to a full hearing, that the Blackthorn family's solicitors had been formally notified, that Damien Blackthorn had therefore known about the proceedings for 36 hours. She sat with that in her London hotel room. She'd taken rooms near King's Cross, not Mayfair, not anywhere with social resonance, and worked through what it meant that he'd known for 36 hours and she had not been told. He knew. He had known since Wednesday. He was somewhere in this city right now, in his townhouse or Whitmore's drawing room or some other room of managed surfaces, knowing that Thursday was coming and knowing that Evelyn would be in that room and knowing that the complete archive of what his family had done was going to be read into a public record in front of everyone who had watched her leave London in disgrace. She wondered what he was doing with the 36 hours. She found out at 7 that evening when he knocked on the door of her hotel room. She opened it because she'd been expecting something. Not specifically him, but something. The situation had a momentum now that she could feel in the specific way you feel the approach of a weather system before it arrives, a pressure change in everything around you. He looked like someone who had not slept. Not dramatically disheveled, he was Damien Blackthorne, and his self-presentation was structural rather than habitual, maintained below the level of conscious effort. But there were marks on him that she recognized as the marks of someone who has been sitting alone with an irrevocable thing for a day and a half. "I know about the proceeding," he said. "I know you know. Can I come in?" She stood in the doorway for a moment. Then she stepped back. He came in. He didn't sit. He stood in the center of the small hotel room with its ordinary furniture and its view of a London side street, and looked at her with the expression she'd seen beginning to form in the Yorkshire study, the one that arrived when the management fell away and there was just a man standing in the actual weight of the actual thing. "Whitmore set this up," he said. "He used you. He used Graves. He built a case around you while you thought you were building it yourself. I know. He wants the engagement terminated on his terms, not yours. He wants the Blackthorne name destroyed in a way that... Evelyn, he has already identified another match for Cecilia. He filed the paperwork on it 2 weeks ago. This proceeding isn't about justice for you. It's about him managing his daughter's future without the complication of a name that carries debt." She looked at him. "Does that change what your family did?" "No." "Does it change what will be said on Thursday?" A pause. "No." "Then why are you here?" He looked at her, and the thing that came across his face in the space between the question and his answer was something she had not seen there before. Not the controlled exhaustion of their earlier meetings, not the managed gravity of a man assessing situations, but something rawer than either. The specific expression of a person who has run out of the version of themselves that knows how to handle things. "Because I needed to tell you," he said, "before that room, that I understand what was done to you. Not what my father did, what I did, the choice I made, the convenience I found in not asking questions, and the specific cruelty of letting you spend 2 years believing you were helping someone who did." He stopped. The muscle in his jaw worked. "I needed to tell you that I know what it was, not managed, not in a context where I have something to gain from the telling, just, you should know that I know." The room was very quiet. The side street outside produced its ordinary sounds. A cart, voices, a door. Eveline stood 3 feet from a man she had loved, who had destroyed her, who had stood in her rooms and asked her for a silence she hadn't given him, who had ridden north to tell her a truth that his secretary had already transferred, who was standing in front of her now with nothing left to manage and nothing to offer, and apparently needing her to know, before whatever happened Thursday happened, that he understood the shape of the wound he'd made. She breathed. "I know you know," she said quietly. "That's not..." He stopped himself. He looked at her. "I'm not asking for anything. I'm not here to negotiate the proceeding or ask you to change what you're doing. I'm here because on Thursday, everyone in that room will know everything, and I needed you to know, before that I would do it differently." He paused. The weight of what he was about to say visible in the half-second before he said it. Not the difficult decision, not the estate, not the choices the family required, but you. What I let happen to you, I would not do that. "You don't know that," she said. "You don't know who you would be if the same pressures arrived the same way." "No." He held her gaze. "But I know who I am now, having done it. And that person cannot stand in that room on Thursday and let you walk in without knowing that the account isn't complete until I've said it to you directly." Eveline looked at him for a long time. The fire in the small grate. The London street outside. The particular quality of a hotel room that belongs to nobody, that is just space between one place and another. "Sit down," she said. He sat. She sat across from him. Not close. The width of the room between them, which was not large but was the right distance for what this was. "Tell me about the letter," she said. "Your father's letter. Not the content. I have that. Tell me when you found it." And he told her. He told her all of it, and for the first time in all the conversations they'd had since October, neither of them was managing anything. She listened and he spoke, and outside London moved through its ordinary Saturday evening, and the fire burned down and neither of them moved to add to it. When he finished, they sat in the quiet for a while. "Go home," she said finally. "Get some sleep. And on Thursday, when Vane reads the record into evidence and the panel asks whether you contest the documentation." She looked at him. "Don't." He held her gaze. I won't. He stood. He picked up his coat. He moved to the door and stopped, hand on the frame, and she had the strange temporal vertigo of a moment that rhymed with something older. The same posture, the same door, the same halt before an exit that didn't feel complete. For what it's worth, he said, not turning around. Don't, she said. Not unkindly. He left. She sat alone in the hotel room for a long time in the quiet, in the ordinary London dark. Thursday was 4 days away. The documents were with Vane. The panel was convened. Whitmore had built his architecture, and she was standing inside it, not as his mechanism, but as the person at the center of something that was now larger than any of them had independently designed. Damien would stand in that room and not contest the record. Cecilia Whitmore would learn, in the most public possible venue, the foundation her engagement had been built on. And Reginald Whitmore, who had positioned himself as the invisible hand of all of it, would discover, in that same room, that the instrument he'd built had developed an opinion about being used. She thought about the letter in the cedar box, her mother's rubies, the pearl set from Colombo, the diamond earrings she'd worn to her first London ball. She thought about 5 years of navigating a world that had decided her value before she arrived. She thought about what she was going to say when the panel asked her to give her account. She had been preparing the statement for 6 weeks. She knew every word of it. She had written it and rewritten it and stripped out every trace of performance, every bid for sympathy, every rhetorical structure that would let anyone in that room feel like they were watching a woman be emotional rather than listening to a woman be precise. She was going to walk into that room and she was going to tell the truth in the cleanest possible language, and she was going to let the document speak the rest of it. 4 days. She got up. She went to the desk. She opened the cedar box and took out the statement and read it through one final time. Not to revise it, but to know it the way you know the ground under your feet before you walk out onto something that has to hold you. It would hold. She was sure of that now in a way she hadn't been 6 weeks ago, hadn't been in November, hadn't been on the floor of the Cavendish Square rooms pressing her hands against her eyes while Damien's footsteps faded down the stairs. She had paid for this. In money, and in time, and in every social tie that had dissolved over a single newspaper column on a Tuesday morning. She had paid for the right to stand in that room and tell the truth, and let it land where it needed to land. What she didn't know, what none of them knew, in their separate rooms in the same city, each carrying their piece of it toward the same Thursday morning, was that Reginald Whitmore had made one more move, a move he hadn't mentioned in Berkeley Square, a document he hadn't shown her, a piece of the picture that would arrive in that hearing room with the weight of something that hadn't been on any of their maps, and that would force the proceeding, in its final moments, into a reckoning that none of them had calculated for. A document signed not by the late Duke, not by Damien, not by anyone whose name had yet appeared in this account, signed by Eveline Ashcroft herself, dated 6 months before the first debt had ever been mentioned to her, and bearing in the margin in her own handwriting 7 words that she had written and forgotten and that were about to arrive in that room like a match held to the edge of everything she'd built. The document arrived in Eveline's hands at 8 in the morning on Thursday, delivered by a clerk from Vane's office, who handed it over with the careful neutrality of someone who has been told to deliver a thing and form no opinion about it. She read it standing in the hotel corridor, still in her coat, the clerk already retreating down the stairs. She read it once and then stood very still with it held in both hands and let the meaning of it move through her completely, the way you let cold water move through you when there is no choice but to stand in it. The document was a promissory note, standard legal form, the language of it familiar from years of managing her father's estate affairs. Dated March 1887, 6 months before she'd made her first financial contribution to the Blackthorne household, 8 months before she'd sold the first piece of her mother's jewelry. Signed in her own hand, which she recognized the way you recognize your own reflection, immediately, without question, with the particular intimacy of something that is entirely yours. She had no memory of signing it. She stood in the corridor and worked backward through March of 1887 with the systematic attention of someone trying to locate a room in a house they know well, and found nothing. A gap. Not a suppressed memory, not something she was refusing to look at, but an actual absence in the record. March 1887 had been an ordinary month. She had been in London, newly established, navigating the first careful year of her social life. She had met Damien at Lady Pemberton's in February. March would have been. Correspondence, fittings, the ordinary machinery of a life being built. The 7 words in the margin were in her handwriting. She could not read them without feeling the specific wrongness of seeing your own script say something your mind has no record of deciding. He has earned what I give freely. She folded the document. She put it in her coat pocket. She went back into her room and sat on the edge of the bed and breathed until the breathing was steady rather than managed. And then she thought. Someone had her signature on a document she didn't remember signing. Someone had held it for, she counted, nearly 4 years, unused, and had given it to Whitmore, or Whitmore had found it, or it had been among the materials Graves had transferred. Someone had known, 4 years ago, that she would one day need to be manageable. The question was not whether the document was forged. Her handwriting was her handwriting. The question was the context, when and where, and what she had believed she was signing when she signed it, and whether the context of the signing could be established and documented with the same rigor that Vane had brought to everything else. She had 2 hours before the proceeding. She put her coat back on. She went to find Vane. Vane's office near Gray's Inn was a 15-minute walk in the December cold, and she covered it at a pace that had nothing to do with the temperature and everything to do with the particular energy of a person who has decided that the 2 hours available to them are not going to be wasted on the wrong kind of thinking. Panic was a form of wasted thinking. She had learned this at 23 when her father died, and the estate affairs arrived on her desk with the weight and complexity of something designed for a different pair of hands. And she had learned it again in October when a column on page 3 had restructured her entire social world overnight. You had a fixed amount of functional attention. You could spend it on the sensation of the problem or on the problem itself, and only one of those allocations produced anything useful. Vane was already at his desk when she arrived, which meant he'd been there for hours, which meant he was a man who prepared for significant days the way soldiers prepare for engagements. Early, thorough, with the understanding that everything that can be done in advance should be. He looked at her face when she came through the door and held out his hand without preamble. She gave him the document. He read it. His face did not change. This was either professionalism or the expression of a man who has already seen the document and is observing her reaction to it, and after 3 seconds she understood it was the latter. "You knew," she said. "I received a copy yesterday afternoon," he said, "from Whitmore's office. I was determining how to present it to you. And I needed to speak to you about it in person rather than in writing, which is why I sent the clerk this morning. I intended the conversation to happen here with adequate time." He set the document on the desk. "Sit down, Miss Ashcroft." She sat. He folded his hands. "The document is genuine," he said. "The signature is yours. I had it examined last night by a man whose professional opinion on handwriting is accepted by every court in England. He is certain. I don't remember signing it." "I know." He looked at her steadily. "Which is why I also spent last night locating the solicitor who witnessed it. His name is Philip Harrow. He is 74 years old, retired, and living in Kensington. I visited him at 6 this morning." A pause. "He remembers the signing clearly. He also remembers the context in which it was presented to you." The room was very quiet. Outside, Gray's Inn was doing its Thursday morning business. Clerks and barristers and the ordinary commerce of the law moving through the cold with their papers and their purpose. "Tell me," she said. "You signed it at a gathering at the Blackthorn townhouse in March 1887. You had been there for dinner. Several documents were presented for signature in the course of the evening. Routine matters relating to a charitable subscription you had agreed to participate in, along with 2 other guests. This document was placed among them. Harrow was instructed to present it as part of the same package." Vane's voice remained even throughout. The evenness was professional, but it was also, she understood, a form of respect. He was giving her the facts without the framing that would tell her how to feel about them. He did not explain what it was specifically. "You signed it in sequence with the others." He witnessed it. The late Duke was present. She sat with it. She had signed a promissory note, a legal document establishing her voluntary commitment to contribute funds to the Blackthorn household, 8 months before she'd been told anything about the family's financial situation, in a room full of papers, presented as part of a routine package, without explanation of its specific nature. She had been set up to create the legal foundation of her own exploitation before she knew there was an exploitation being designed. The 7 words in the margin. He has earned what I give freely, written by her hand in her own script, and she understood now, with the sickening precision of someone who has just located the mechanism of something they couldn't account for, that those words had been written at the gathering too, probably at the late Duke's suggestion, probably framed as a personal notation on a charitable subscription, probably filed away the moment she handed back the pen, with the care of something intended to be kept for a purpose she was never meant to understand. The late Duke, not Damien. This piece was the late Duke's architecture entirely, constructed before his son had any say in it. She had walked into the Blackthorn household and been documented as a willing contributor before she'd made a single choice. She thought about Damien saying, "I didn't design it." She thought about what that meant with this additional layer visible, that even his participation had been structured by his father, that the inheritance he'd received included not just the debt and the estate, but the instrument of her management already in place, already signed, already witnessed. She did not feel mercy about this. She felt something more complicated than mercy, the specific difficulty of a picture that keeps acquiring detail, that changes the angle without changing the fact. "How does this affect the proceeding?" she said. "That depends on how Whitmore intends to use it," Vane said. "If he presents it as evidence that your contributions were legally voluntary and pre-committed, it potentially undermines the fraudulent misrepresentation claim. You signed a document establishing your willingness before any misrepresentation was made. Even though I didn't know what I was signing, Harrow's testimony establishes the context, but Whitmore's barrister could argue that the signature exists, the witness exists, and the claim of ignorance is post hoc." He looked at her. "This is why I needed to speak with you this morning, not to alarm you, but to ensure that your statement to the panel addresses this directly." "He's going to use it against me," she said. "He may use it to ensure the outcome he wants, which is not necessarily the same as what's best for you." Vane's voice had a quality in it now, beneath the professional evenness, that she recognized as something personal, something that had been building in an old man's chest over the months of assembling this case and arriving at the understanding of exactly what had been done. "Miss Ashcroft, I have practiced law for 47 years. I have seen documents used the way this document was constructed more times than I can count. What was done to you in March 1887 was deliberate, and it was skilled, and it was the work of a man who understood that the most durable trap is the one the occupant appears to have walked into freely." She looked at him. "You did not walk into it freely," he said. "You walked into a room where the trap had been built around what looked like a door. That distinction matters, and I intend to make it matter this morning." She nodded once. It wasn't gratitude, or not only gratitude. It was the recognition of an ally, which was different and rarer, and which she had learned not to take for granted. "Then let's go," she said. The winter court convening was held in a hall off St. James's, a grand room of the kind that London maintained for occasions requiring the full weight of assembled consequence, with high ceilings and long windows, and the particular acoustics of a space designed to make voices carry without being raised. By the time Evelyn arrived, the hall was already populated with the kind of density that December court gatherings produced. The full London aristocracy in winter dress, the social and legal worlds overlapping in the specific way they overlapped, when a proceeding carried enough significance to draw both. She had been to rooms like this before. She had navigated their geography, their social weather, their elaborate grammar of who stood where and what that meant. She had done it as an outsider learning the rules, and as a member of their world, and as the subject of their cruelty, and she walked into this one as something different from all of those, as the woman at the center of a record that was about to be read aloud in front of everyone who had watched her leave in disgrace 2 years prior. She saw Damien across the room before he saw her. He was standing with a composure that she recognized from the outside as the particular composure of someone who has stopped managing and is simply enduring, upright, present, with the stillness of a man who has decided what he's going to do and is waiting for the moment to do it. He was alone. No family solicitor, no attendant, none of the social architecture that aristocratic men deployed in difficult public situations. Just him in his coat, in the room, present. He turned his head and found her, and the look that passed between them across that hall was not a communication exactly, not readable as any specific message, but it had a quality of recognition that went underneath language, The specific recognition of two people who know each other's actual dimensions and are standing in the same room with those dimensions visible. She moved toward the panel's table. Vane was already there. Whitmore was seated to the right of the panel, not at the witness position, but in the attendant area, the position of a man who has submitted supporting documentation and is present as a secondary party. He looked, when she passed him, exactly as she expected him to look, composed, watchful, the slightly forward lean of someone following a process they believe they understand completely. He caught her eye. She held his gaze for exactly the length of time required to let him know she wasn't afraid of him, and then she moved on. The panel convened. 3 men, senior legal figures whose names she knew from Vane's briefing, whose faces she'd studied in the same way she studied all available information before walking into rooms that mattered. The presiding member was a man named Caldwell, 60-ish, with the expression of someone who has sat through enough proceedings to have developed a permanent skepticism about everyone's account, including his own. Caldwell opened the session. He summarized the matter, the documentation, the claims, the parties present. He had the civil servant's gift for reducing complicated human catastrophe to procedural language, which was not coldness, but a kind of professional mercy. It kept the room from becoming about feeling before it had finished becoming about fact. Vane was called first. He presented the documentation with the systematic precision of a man who has prepared for exactly this for 6 months: the deed transfers, the bank records, the jewelry sale receipts, the household ledger with its EA personal notation, the sealed letter, Harrow's signed statement about the March 1887 gathering and the context of the promissory note signing. He presented the promissory note itself. He presented it with Harrow's testimony attached, and he spoke, in measured and unornamented language, to the distinction between a signature obtained in full knowledge and a signature obtained through deliberate concealment of context. He named the late Duke. He named the instruction given to Harrow. He named the date and the room and the package of papers. The hall was very quiet. Then Eveline was called. She stood at the witness position and looked at Caldwell and gave her statement. She had written it and rewritten it, and she knew every word, and she delivered it the way she'd practiced it. Not flat, not performed, just the clean line of a woman saying true things in their true order. The facts, the timeline, the cost, the column. The specific experience of having your credibility removed as a preemptive measure. The years of silence. She did not ask for sympathy. She did not describe her feelings in the language of appeal. She described actions and consequences with the same precision that the legal documents describe numbers, and she let the room fill in what those actions and consequences meant to the human being who had lived through them. When she was done, the hall was still in the particular way that means something has landed without anyone wanting to be the first to show it. Caldwell called Damien. Damien walked to the witness position. He stood in it the way he stood in every room, with that physical self-possession that was structural rather than performed, and looked at Caldwell and then, for a moment, at Eveline, and then back at the panel. Caldwell asked whether he contested the documentation. "No," Damien said. The word dropped into the room with the clean weight of something irrevocable. Caldwell asked whether the record of his family's financial arrangements as presented was accurate to his knowledge. "Yes," he said, "with the addition that the March 1887 document was my father's arrangement, not mine, and that I was informed of its existence only after my father's death." He paused. "I am not presenting that as mitigation. It is a fact relevant to the record." Caldwell asked whether he acknowledged that the management of Miss Ashcroft's reputation, the column, the public narrative, had been deliberately designed to preempt any account she might offer of the financial arrangements. The room held its breath in the specific way rooms do when a question has been asked that everyone present understands cannot be answered partially. "Yes," Damien said. Caldwell asked whether that decision had been his. "Yes." The room exhaled. Eveline looked at her hands on the table in front of her and felt something she hadn't been prepared to feel, not vindication, which she'd expected to feel, and not satisfaction, which would have been understandable. Something quieter and more disorienting than either. Something that felt like the specific exhaustion of a long-held tension finally releasing, which is not the same as relief because relief implies something has been restored, and nothing here was being restored. Only acknowledged. Then Caldwell turned to Whitmore's document submission and asked the secondary witness to address the promissory note. Whitmore stood. He spoke for 3 minutes. He presented the document as evidence of the voluntary nature of Evelyn's contributions, argued that Harrow's testimony regarding context was insufficient to override the legal force of the signature, suggested that the fraudulent misrepresentation claim was complicated by the existence of a prior commitment. He made the argument with the skilled brevity of a man who knows he is making it in a room where it will not be well received, but who has calculated that its presence in the record serves a purpose regardless. He sat down. Evelyn looked at him. He looked back at her, and for the first time since Berkeley Square, she saw something move in his expression that was not the operational composure she'd read there before, something smaller and less certain, the expression of a man who is in the middle of a room he thought he understood and is discovering in real time that he understood it incompletely. Vane rose. He addressed the panel for 11 minutes with the composed devastation of a man who has practiced law for 47 years and has been waiting for this specific argument to arrive so he could dismantle it. He walked through Harrow's testimony line by line. He addressed the legal precedent for invalidating signatures obtained through deliberate concealment of context. He presented 3 prior cases, names and dates, outcomes. He demonstrated, with the patience of someone who knows the room is with him, that the promissory note was not evidence of voluntary contribution, but evidence of the sophistication of the mechanism designed to extract contribution. He sat down. Caldwell made a note. He conferred briefly with the 2 other panel members. The room waited in the particular quality of silence that precedes an outcome that most people in it have already understood. Caldwell looked up. He addressed the room in the formal language of a proceeding that has reached its finding, and what he said, in the plain legal register of a man who does not editorialize, was that the documentation supported the claim of fraudulent misrepresentation, that the promissory note's validity was compromised by the established context of its signing, and that the matter of financial remedy would proceed to a secondary proceeding to establish quantum. He looked at Damien. He said in the same register that the panel's formal note would reflect the acknowledgement offered by the respondent, and that the acknowledgement would stand in the permanent record of the proceeding. He closed the session. The room came alive. The quality of a large group of people beginning to process something and turning to the nearest person to do it in was immediate and unmistakable. The rising register of voices, the movement of bodies, the particular social energy of a scandal fully materialized. Evelyn sat at the table and did not move immediately. She let the room do what rooms do after something like this, and sat in the center of it and breathed, and felt the specific texture of the moment she was in. This was what she had built toward. This was the room she had been preparing for since November, in Yorkshire, on the floor of the Cavendish Square rooms, in every cold morning walk across the moorland and every late evening at the writing desk. This was the moment of the record being set right. It was not triumphant. She had expected, somewhere in the preparation, that it might feel triumphant, and it didn't. It felt true, which was different and more sustainable, and in some ways more important, and also more exhausting than triumph would have been, because truth doesn't give you the clean adrenaline of a victory. It just gives you the weight of a thing that has finally been put in its correct place. Vane touched her arm. "It's done," he said quietly. "Yes," she said. She stood. She picked up her papers. She moved through the room, which parted for her in the specific way rooms part for people who have just been vindicated in front of everyone who once watched them be destroyed, with the discomfort of people who participated in the watching, and the murmur of people who didn't but wished they had, and the particular noise of Reginald Whitmore's silence as she passed him, which was the silence of a man recalculating in real time. She did not look at him as she passed. She had made her point in Berkeley Square about not being a mechanism, and the proceeding had made the rest of it. She didn't need the moment of eye contact. She was almost at the door when Damien found her. He came to stand beside her rather than in front of her. Not blocking, not confronting, just beside, which was a choice she noticed. His voice was low enough for just the 2 of them. "Are you all right?" he said. She thought about this question honestly. "I don't know yet," she said. "I think I will be." "What happens now?" "The secondary proceeding for remedy. Vane expects it to conclude within the month." She looked straight ahead at the door. "After that I go back to Yorkshire. I have a garden wall that needs finishing before spring." A pause. She heard him breathing. "Miss Ashcroft." He stopped, started again. Evelyn. He used her name without the gentling, the same way he'd said it in the hotel room, raw, unmanaged, just her name in his mouth. I don't expect anything from you. I want to be clear about that. I'm not standing here with an expectation. I know, she said. I just want to know that you're going to be all right. That what happens next for you is… He paused. Good. That it's actually good. She turned her head and looked at him. He was looking back at her with the expression that had no management in it, no calculation, just a man standing in the aftermath of the thing he'd done and asking, without the right to ask but without the pretense of not needing to, whether the person he'd damaged was going to be okay. The hall was loud around them. London doing what London did with a scandal, processing it loudly and immediately, and without particular concern for the people it had been made of. Yes, she said, it's going to be good. He held her gaze for a moment. Then he nodded. He stepped back. She walked out. The secondary proceeding concluded on the 14th of January. The financial remedy was substantial, not punitive, in the way that Vane had quietly argued for moderating it, because punishment had never been the point, and an amount calibrated for devastation rather than restoration would have made her something she didn't want to be. It was accurate. It covered the documented transfers, the jewelry, the property, the secondary assets Whitmore's records had revealed. It covered, with the quiet precision of good legal work, the cost of what had been taken. Damien signed the settlement documents without contesting them. His solicitor, by all accounts, had advised against this. He signed them anyway. The Blackthorn name did not disappear from London society. Names like that don't disappear. They weather. They accumulate damage and continue, altered. But the weathering was real, and it was permanent. The engagement to Cecilia Whitmore was dissolved within a week of the proceeding. Whitmore had made this decision before the hearing, as it turned out, which Cecilia learned along with everything else, and which she had, by all reports, taken with the particular composure of a young woman who is angry and devastated and has the underlying solidity to survive both. She left London for her cousin's house in Scotland and stayed there through the winter, and the letters she received and sent during that period were not anyone's business but her own. Whitmore attempted, in the weeks following the proceeding, to position himself as the man who had brought the Blackthorn deception to light. This did not go as smoothly as he'd calculated, partly because Evelyn had given Vane a full account of the Berkeley Square meeting and the interception of her letter to Cecilia, and partly because a man who intercepts his daughter's correspondence and manages her access to information about her own engagement operates in a category that London society found, on reflection, uncomfortable to celebrate. He was not ruined. Men like Whitmore don't ruin easily, but the version of himself he'd intended to construct from this, the righteous patriarch who exposed aristocratic corruption, acquired enough complication to be merely a man who had pursued his own interests and gotten most of what he wanted, which was a less flattering story and the accurate one. What? Evelyn went back to Yorkshire in the last week of January. The garden wall Mrs. Brennan had been commenting on since November was addressed in the first week of February, with 2 local craftsmen and Evelyn herself doing the pointing work on the lower courses, because she wanted to use her hands on something that would hold. She found, as she'd suspected she would, that physical work had a specific restorative quality that no amount of careful thinking could approximate. The weight of the mortar trowel, the cold of the stone, the visible progress of a thing being made sound. She thought about Damien sometimes, not with the quality of thought that had occupied her in the months of building the case, the strategic, mapping attention of someone assessing a situation. More ordinarily than that, she thought about him the way you think about a significant thing that has become historical, present in the past, no longer operating on the present, but part of the architecture of who you are now. She thought about what he'd said in the hotel room, in the dark, in the ordinary London night. She thought about whether he would have been different, under different circumstances, built by different hands. She didn't know. She didn't need to know. The counterfactual version of Damien Blackthorn was not her responsibility to imagine. What she held and returned to was the simpler version. He had done a serious thing, and he had stood in a room and said so without managing the saying of it, and that had not repaired anything but had been its own kind of fact, and facts accumulate into the record of who people are. She was not sure she forgave him. She was not sure forgiveness was the right category. What she had instead was something that felt more like the specific experience of understanding something completely, understanding the shape of it, the origin, the mechanics, and finding that the understanding had done something to the wound, not healed it, changed its texture, made it a part of her history rather than an ongoing injury. She thought she could live with that. She thought she was already living with it. The estate came into its own that spring. The garden, cleared and replanted, produced its first showing of color in April. Modest, nothing grand, but planned and tended and growing in the direction she'd put it. The house was warm and sound. Mrs. Brennan had opinions about everything, and Evelyn had learned to find this not merely tolerable, but genuinely pleasant, in the way that people with strong views who apply them honestly are pleasant company compared to people whose views are managed for effect. She walked the moorland every morning. She ran the estate accounts and the household and the correspondence with local magistrates and neighboring landowners, and the network of people who were becoming incrementally her actual community. Not the acquired community of a London social life, built on access and proximity, but something grown from shared geography and repeated encounter and the slow accumulation of mutual knowledge. She was happy. Not the word she'd have used before. Too simple, too flat. Not enough for what she'd thought happiness needed to be to qualify. But she was using it now because she'd discovered, on the other side of everything that had happened, that happiness didn't require grandeur. It required ground. It required a life that was actually yours, built from your actual choices with your actual resources, oriented toward things that had your actual name on them rather than someone else's. She had ground. She had built it herself from the ruins of what had been taken, and it held. Count Adrian Veilhart arrived in her life that summer through the most ordinary possible mechanism. He was a neighboring landowner, 2 estates north, a widower of 4 years who had come south to address a drainage dispute with a shared water boundary and had been introduced to her at a village assembly in July by the local magistrate who considered himself a social architect of modest ambition. She did not fall in love with him immediately. She had learned to be careful about immediacy, about the particular seduction of someone who arrives in your life at the moment you are newly capacious for them. When your defenses are down, not because you're vulnerable, but because you've done enough work to stop needing them in their previous form. She was careful. She watched him with the same quality of attention she brought to everything she valued, steadily, without performing either warmth or caution, just looking. What she found, over the months of that summer and into the autumn, was a man who had no interest in her as a function. He had lost his wife 3 years prior to an illness that had taken time to announce itself and longer to complete, and the loss had done something to him that grief sometimes does to certain kinds of people. It had simplified him, stripped away the accretions of social ambition and the management of impression, and left something more primary underneath, a man who knew what mattered and had stopped spending energy on what didn't. He never asked about London. He never asked about the proceeding. He knew because everyone in the northern counties who read the papers knew, but he seemed to regard it as her history, present, relevant, not requiring excavation for his benefit. When she eventually told him the full account, one evening in October when the fire was good and the conversation had reached a depth at which partial accounts felt dishonest, he listened with the full attention of someone who is filing the information as important rather than interesting. And when she finished, he said, "That must have been a very long time to carry." "Yes," she said. "And now?" "Now it's part of the record," she said. "Not gone, but set down." He looked at her. He had a quality in his eyes, Adrian, of someone who understood that the difference between set down and over was significant and was not going to pretend otherwise. "Good," he said. She found, in the months that followed, that she trusted him. Not in the sudden, total way she had trusted Damien. That kind of trust, she had come to understand, was not a measure of safety, but a measure of depth. And depth is not the same as soundness. The trust she built with Adrian was incremental and evidence-based, built from accumulated demonstrations of the kind of person he was in the ordinary situations that reveal character more reliably than grand ones. The way he spoke to people who had no social power over him, the way he handled being wrong, the way he held her silence when she needed it to be held. She did not confuse this for the absence of feeling. It was feeling that had been given the conditions it needed to grow into something that could bear weight. She told him, one cold morning in November while they walked the boundary of her estate, that she loved him. She said it without preamble, without the architecture of setup, just the plain statement of a true thing in its true order. He stopped walking. He looked at her with the expression of a man receiving something he'd been careful not to assume. "I love you," he said. I wanted to be sure you had the time you needed." "I've had time," she said. "I've had years of time." He took her hand. They stood on the moorland in the November cold and looked at the estate. Her estate, the stone house sound and warm in the middle distance, smoke rising straight in the windless morning. And she felt the particular quality of standing in the right place at the right time with the right person, which is a simple thing, and which she had learned, the long way, to recognize as the kind of simple thing that most people spend their entire lives looking for. She thought about Damien one last time that winter, genuinely thought about him, in the way that requires you to stop and sit with something, rather than letting it pass through. She'd heard, through Vane's occasional professional correspondence, that he was rebuilding. Not the estate. The estate was managing on reduced means, the Whitmore settlement having removed the last of its artificial foundations and left it facing its actual numbers. But him, specifically. He had, apparently, taken a position advising a manufacturing concern in the north, work that had no aristocratic precedent, work that required the kind of direct intelligence he had in abundance, and had spent his life deploying in the service of managing appearances rather than solving actual problems. She hoped it was going well. She found, sitting with the thought honestly, that she genuinely hoped it was going well. Not as performance of magnanimity, not as the public-facing version of a generous spirit, just the actual hope that a person she had known at his worst, and also at something closer to his actual self, was finding his way toward something real. The man he could have been, who he had briefly been, in the hotel room in the Yorkshire study and the witness position where he'd said yes without managing the yes, that man was worth hoping for. She put the thought down. She went to find Adrian. They were building something on the east edge of the estate, a set of small cottages, soundly made, intended for families who had been displaced by the economic pressures of the decade and needed somewhere with solid walls and honest rent, and a landlord who had once needed something like that herself and remembered what it cost not to have it. Adrian was talking to the foreman about the window casings when she found him. He looked up and his face did the thing it did when he saw her. Not dramatically, just a shift of quality, a slight opening, the involuntary expression of someone who is glad of the arrival. She came to stand beside him. They looked at the cottages going up in the winter light. Bare stone for now, the roofs half done, the walls solid and true. Something being built to last. "The east wall's going up straight," she said. "The foreman knows his work," Adrian said. "I just asked the right questions." She looked at the walls going up clean against the Yorkshire sky and thought, not about Damien, not about London, not about the proceeding or the record or the long work of getting here. She thought about the families who would live in these rooms, the fires they'd make in the grates, the mornings they'd wake up in walls that held. She thought, this is it. This is the thing. Not the vindication, not the record set right, not even the love standing beside her in the cold. Though the love mattered, the love was real and load-bearing, and she would not minimize it. But this, the specific act of taking what had been taken from you and building something with it that someone else would need. She had not won by taking back what she'd lost. She had won by discovering that the loss had changed the shape of what she wanted to build, and that the new shape was better than the original plan, and that the person she was on the other side of everything was someone she could actually respect. The wall went up straight. The winter light moved across the moorland. Beside her, Adrian said something to the foreman about the east-facing windows, and the foreman agreed, and somewhere south of them, London continued its business, carrying its scandals and its ambitions and its long memory for whose name deserved what. Evelyn Ashcroft stood in the field of her own life and breathed the cold Yorkshire air and let the morning be exactly what it was. It was enough. It was, finally and completely, more than enough.